And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to have everyone here. It's already an amazing crowd. We have something very special for you tonight on this MLK Day here, this special holiday honoring Martin Luther King, who was the slain civil rights leader and holy man, I guess, in many ways you could say. Of course, as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And it's interesting and it's good to keep in mind with Martin Luther King that he was not beyond rebuking the culture that he was in. And this is a very important thing, I think, that we find. This idea of rebuke, that is, when you see a government going over the line and acting not in the interests of its citizens, you have that right then to rebuke and to charge a movement to get them to change. And we've seen so many things that we need to change that Martin Luther King is an excellent role model for how he approached that. And let's remember that so much of what he approached with this non-violent method of protest. And that really comes from Gandhi, who came straight out of the mystery school lineage of Annie Besant and Helena Blavatsky, being a member of the Theosophical Society. And Theosophy had really groomed Gandhi to protest British rule of India and not to do it with, guns. And they knew that they were outgunned and that they were spent in terms of armaments, but that there was nothing that could stop a movement of people who were looking for freedom. And that's what I think Martin Luther King really demonstrated so well under incredibly adverse circumstances. Many of his contemporaries we cover on the show, like President John F. Kennedy, who said that space must never become a warfighting domain. The United States has announced with the Space Force that space is now a warfighting domain. So it's a serious violation of our original code. And I put something up today, which was our original signal through Congress, signed by President Eisenhower, saying the United States will never use space for military purposes. And this is a very important thing for us to keep in mind as they try to militarize us into space via the Space Force, which, by the way, is not designed militarily. And so to use it as space being a warfighting domain is a serious, serious violation of its charter. And if we're going to go that route, then we're going to have a lot of problems with this administration, because this administration has really, after kind of understanding so many of the things that were going wrong in government, has now started to become really join in part of the problem as they're kind of fighting each other. They're morphing into each other. So this is a very important place that we find ourselves in at the beginning of 2020. Of course, we almost started the year off with World War III. And, this was also another provocative act on our part. And so something is creeping in here. And I believe it's creeping in through the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who is the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. His agenda seems to be flat out to deliver a belligerent message and to make us into that kind of neocon hawk machine that failed so miserably under the Bush administration, W. Bush. So there's a lot there that we start the year off with many questions. For this episode, we're going to concentrate very much on space, and we're going to also be coming off this wave of the episode that we put out on Friday, which was a revisiting of the revelations of Robert Merritt, who was a secret agent who worked for the Houston Plan in the 70s, and as part of that was doing some very high-level currying for President Nixon in secrets, so that Nixon got to a place where he trusted him. And what Merritt revealed before he died, unfortunately passed away, was that Nixon had kept a secret message concerning UFOs in the White House, and that he had also shared this information with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. So we have that incredible sweep of Merritt's testimony to come into this episode with, and it plays into just about everything in this X episode 79. And this episode is Stealth UFO Archives, and we're looking at the JFK Nixon Reagan Trump connection. This is the presidency and the XTech, and this is how we're going to roll here. And there is an incredible connection, and we could start right off the bat with something I'd like to point out often. And it's interesting, when I first found this, I couldn't believe it because I'd never seen it anywhere. And I broadcast it live here about 1.5 years ago in an episode called Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule, which set the tone for many of the X-Series episodes going forward, revealing its steganography and some of these political connections. But this picture is going to give us a good idea right off the bat. There we have in the middle Governor John Connally of Texas, who was in the assassination car with JFK and survived. But interestingly enough, of course, that is Donald Trump. And over there on the left is former President Richard Nixon, who's going to prominently figure into tonight's episode because of Merritt's revelations. And we're really going to go deep into what that represents. And of course, a lot of questions have come up over it because it's such powerful testimony. This picture is quite a snapshot, and I'll tell you why. When you're in politics, and many people know this, you take pictures not always as just a normal gesture of, hey, I'm taking a picture, but most often it's calculated. Everything in that kind of political world is calculated. And so we go into a situation where you have to ask yourself, why is Nixon being seen with Trump and then John Connally? It is a fundraiser for Connally that's taking place in the 80s when Nixon and Trump had become friends. And there's a letter I showed on this program which shows Nixon writing to Trump and saying, if you run for political office, I predict, it's a very interesting word, that you're going to win. Now, it's quite fascinating because in looking, going through the Robert Merritt story, one of the things I found so interesting about Merritt is that, you know, he was a guest on a religious show very often, and he would talk and go back and forth. And I went and listened to one of those from 2015, which was quite fascinating. And in that particular episode, which took place in July of 2015, and he was talking more generically just about his Watergate experience. Remember, he had never mentioned the Nixon time capsule and had never mentioned anything to do with UFOs until he had come on my program for an exclusive interview February 14th, 2018, and caused quite a firestorm with his remarks. But he would come out, you know, there was a book out about him where he told his story to Douglas Caddy, who was the Watergate lawyer. And of course, Douglas Caddy has been on this program many times. But he told him his story, and it was all about what Watergate, how it had actually happened, and how Merritt was right in the heart of that. And of course, the historical trail is there. You know, Merritt very much was who he said he was. It's undeniable. There's a celebrated New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who used him as an informant and a source on a major story. And that gentleman's name is Michael Powell. And so we have to understand the weight and the gravity of Robert Merritt in that sense when he's speaking about this. But one of the things that I found when I went back and just did some review on some of his interviews that he had given was it was quite fascinating that he spoke about Trump and predicted Trump would become president. Now, Trump had only just announced his presidency, but Merritt seemed incredibly confident.
It was like a month later.
Yes.
He said it was obvious that Trump
he was going to become president.
Nobody else predicted that.
No, well, especially with Clinton there, you would think the machine was going to elect her. So it was a very unusual thing, I think. And it makes me wonder, as we know that he had these unusual conversations with Nixon, and then Nixon later had this close association with Trump. If there wasn't just something there in the works relating to Trump or relating to Trump's uncle, John Trump, who we're going to also spotlight in this program as well, who, of course, was an engineer at MIT and was the protege of Vannevar Bush. If you know anything about the UFO research field, Vannevar Bush was the curator, as it were, of the UFO file before he turned it over to John von Neumann, who we're going to see in this program has a very interesting role tonight. So we're going to take you into a very interesting labyrinth and try to come back out with some answers for this X Series 79. And I'm going to remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist show. And one of the things we've been seeing, of course, is incredible shadow banning crackdowns and social media just really putting things off the radar that they don't want out there, and including the show. And I should point out that you should go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter, because it is the newsletter, in fact, that guarantees we have that pipeline between us. And it's going to help us quite a bit to stay in touch. It's a free newsletter, and it just lets you know once a week what shows are coming up, what topics we're going to be covering, and what amazing guests we're going to have coming up for you, especially here coming up in later January and February. It's an incredible roster, so you're going to want to make sure that you have that lined up. And it's the best way for us to stay in touch, because how many times have I heard people say, I never got the notification from YouTube? That's just part of the course now. So, you know, it's, what is that movie? It was Whose Life Is It Anyway? It's Whose YouTube Is It Anyway? So how are we doing out there before we dive in? How's the...
Doing great. I already have a bunch of questions concerning Friday night show, and but we can wait until the end of this
about Robert Merritt.
Yes,
we're gonna
for clarification.
We have so many interesting things. I mean, I'll do my best. Of course, Merritt was a very enigmatic agent of being a confidential informant for everything from the NYPD to DC police to the CIA to the FBI. I mean, just an incredible career there. And I guess when I speak about Merritt, one of the things I should do is kind of give you some idea of the tone of our conversations. You know, we spent many hours on the phone and in conversation over a long period of time. And one of the things that I got from Merritt was that he had a message. He wanted to put something out. He wasn't too worried about, you know, a book or, you know, his name in lights or anything like that. He just wanted to get this message out about the incredible information that had been given to him, and that he was worried with his illness that he was reaching a point where he wasn't going to be able to do that. And it was time for him to let loose and basically say, look, Nixon had this message and it concerned UFO disclosure. So when we originally put that out, February 14th, 2018 was the first time we released the first interview. And, you know, when I spoke to him subsequently, my impression was, as I included in the most recent version on Friday, that he had almost regretted coming out with this message. And because he, you know, his place had been broken into, he'd experienced certain types of harassment, files were gone, and it was noticeably different. His tone was noticeably different than when I spoke to him before actually going live with all of it. And he was the one who wanted to get that information out. So, you know, I was serving as kind of a conduit for his story. But I had spent time with him, asking him questions and going deeply back and forth on this in such a way that there was no way, if Merritt was just kind of making up this story, that he could keep those details straight. I was really impressed with his recall, and I was really impressed with the sincerity of what he was trying to put across. After all, Merritt was not a UFO enthusiast of any kind. He had learned to become quite a fan of his former boss, President Nixon. And so it makes a really big difference, I think.
Yeah, he didn't care about UFOs or ET at all.
No.
He's a spiritual man. He was a straight shooter. I mean, I've listened to those interviews as well. And you just get a sense he's not holding anything back. You know, he's just, what you see is what you get. You know, he knows he's coming to the end of his life, and, you know, he wants to go to heaven, you know, with a clear conscience. It's very moving. I was incredibly impressed by him.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, he had surfaced at different times. There's a book about Watergate from 1984 by Jim Hogan, which is a classic in this, which opens up the real story about what happened. And he's featured in there. So, you know, we already have people writing about him. But if you go back, and I was looking through a number of things from the 70s, newsletters and things, he's always in there. And, you know, he's associated with Watergate. He's associated with doing surveillance work on political groups. And he's starting to like already have this name very early on. So it's a fantastic story. The thrust of it now is basically this in three parts. One, that he was a confidential informant for the Houston Plan, which the record bears him out on that. The Houston Plan, by the way, is basically like an in-house version of the CIA. It was something which we had developed under President Nixon and a representative named Tom Houston, who had this idea, you know what? Well, this was really Nixon's idea, but he used Houston's plan, which is, I'm going to do the CIA thing myself. I'm going to get around the CIA, which is controlling everything, and I'm going to restore the power back to the presidency by having my own White House intelligence unit. Now, eventually, this is exactly what would unravel President Nixon, because it was through having that unit and then that unit acting on its own or in coordination with the CIA, they were able to take Nixon out. So this is a very interesting thing, and you have to wonder, why would they want to remove Nixon? And this is going to come up tonight, too. The Nixon presidency is particularly important. We've done a lot of coverage on JFK's presidency, and I think we understand some things. Let me tell you, the JFK situation is so complex that I don't want to say for a second that we understand exactly what was going on there. But we understand that JFK was challenging the status quo on a number of areas, and that, you know, this kind of deep state force that Fitz likes to call Mr. Global had had enough. And in particular, now, according to E. Howard Hunt, who said to his friend Douglas Caddy, who came on this program and recalled this for us, that he had asked him why the CIA, who Hunt was a super spy for and had participated in these activities, said why they had assassinated JFK, and Hunt had told him, well, he was about to give our most vital secret away, national security secret away. And so Caddy was totally befuddled by this, and he asked his friend, remember, they had been friends for many years, and I confirmed that with Hunt's son, and that's just part of the historical record. And he said, well, it's the UFO file, you know, it's the alien presence, and this is what he was assassinated over. And again, in this conversation, Caddy wasn't very interested in UFOs, so he didn't know how to follow up, really. So it's very interesting the way these lines of history have come back to us now.
I want to say something right here.
Yeah.
I never really thought about it before, but he doesn't ask any questions. He doesn't, you know, all of us would be like, what do you mean? And,
well,
you know, or chased him.
Remember that Hunt looks in his eyes and, like, you know, friend to friend, there's no, a lot of people have said in relation to Hunt that, you know, he's a CIA guy, so he's going to talk and he's going to spin things, but he's talking here to his friend. This is not for public consumption.
Yes. But
so he just shakes his hand.
All of us have this experience of saying something kind of extraterrestrial related, UFO related to somebody, a family member, a friend, and getting that dumb, like no feedback, right? Just a dumb stare. They don't want it. They don't know how to take it. It doesn't land on anything. Right. There's no curiosity. And so it kind of makes sense in a way, since he had no background, that he didn't ask any questions. There was no follow-up.
I also think that Hunt was the type who, by his very manner, didn't allow for much of it, especially, you know, Caddy was pretty stunned.
But Caddy was determined to get the answer.
Yes.
That night. Yeah.
Oh, before. Well, it's interesting. That story, I think, is fascinating. And it's in my interviews on this channel with Caddy. Because, you know, the reason Caddy is the Watergate lawyer and got involved is because Hunt, being the person who was orchestrating the break-in, called him to represent the burglars, so try to get them off, basically. And the problem was the Watergate burglars were caught. One of them was caught with Central Intelligence Agency ID on him. That was what set off a firestorm of, you know, where is this little unit coming from, really? So this was like a Hail Mary attempt to send Caddy in to get them off and maybe try to wriggle their way out of it. But by the time this was already taking place, a process was kicking in. You know, Bob Woodward and people like that were already on the story. And they'd been tipped early by someone named Carl Schaffler, who figures very prominently in Merritt's story. And Merritt basically identifies him as military intelligence, pretending to be a normal policeman, but he wasn't. And Merritt knew him very well and had been on very kind of dangerous escapades and had done a lot of spying for him. So it's quite interesting, and there's so many layers to that. But I would say this in relation to Hunt and the UFO file. Hunt came forward at the end of his life and identified LBJ as being involved in the assassination with the CIA. There are people from within the CIA who came out and identified it. And it's a very tricky situation when we're here in 2020 and we've seen the CIA trying to basically overthrow an American election in 2016 and try to really come out hard against the presidency. These are the same people, the same group, the same unchecked power unit, which continues to grow, has their own Air Force, and continues to provoke things in the Middle East and other parts of the world. So we find ourselves in a situation where you have this agency inside the government, which is just this incredible, even the presidents don't know how to bottle this thing up. So I think this is important when we go back and we look at some of these revelations, because part of the problem is there's no accounting. And the fact that the CIA, even now, 56 years later, holds those records on the JFK assassination is absurd, because there's no reason in the world except the fact that they're guilty of a cover-up and more. So that's really the nature of the problem that we're looking at here.
I want to address something right away.
Yeah.
Okay, so Calator Mensa says LBJ was made an accessory after the fact that fully compromises him. Of course, we know that's not true. That LBJ knew, very much knew, about the assassination beforehand.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, there's so much material available on LBJ and his role in the Kennedy assassination. One, as his VP, he had told others who were close to him that, don't worry, he's going to be president because Kennedy isn't going to live. And they assumed that this was something in relation to a medical condition that Kennedy had. And everyone wondered why the Senate Majority Leader, which is an incredibly powerful position, why someone in that position would give it up for the vice presidency, which is one of the most limited positions in the entire government, except for the fact that if the big guy dies, you're in. So there was something right off the bat going on with LBJ going into this. But certainly we've covered some of that. I guess one of the most essential things you'd want to say in relation to LBJ on this is that he came out in an interview in 1969 with Walter Cronkite and said he didn't believe the Warren Commission. This is his own report that he set up. And he said, I think there could have been others involved. And he would say a few years later that we were running a murder incorporated in the Caribbean there in the hot zone, and that he felt that that had been turned somehow against Kennedy. This was his kind of letting himself off the hook, that he wasn't associated with it. And if you think about it, I mean, LBJ died pretty young, 64 years old. So I think his death is kind of unusual, taking place there in 1973 before Watergate. And if you look at the incredible back and forth between him, Johnson and Nixon, and the ways they had of blackmailing each other, it's quite fascinating, because coming out of the presidency, LBJ still wanted to swing a big bat, and he thought that he had that blackmail on Nixon in order to do that. So it's a very complex situation with Nixon blackmailing him and saying, I know all about the Kennedy part, so it's a very unusual piece of history there, because they're going back and forth. But of course, both of them were in a position to benefit from the assassination of Robert Kennedy that takes place during 1968, because on one hand, you have Nixon, who needs to get in. And with Bobby Kennedy is going to run, Nixon is going to find himself losing to a Kennedy again. That's extremely problematic. So the forces that were behind Nixon and the forces that were, pro-Johnson both coalesced there. And that's part of this deep state assassination ritual that they've had going on. And it is quite interesting. And I want to say that Robert Kennedy Jr., who's been doing a great job of protesting on things like vaccines and the excessive government takeover of medicine, he really pointed out that as on that anniversary of the death of Thane Eugene Caesar, who was the security guard who worked for Lockheed Martin, who was there at the Ambassador Hotel that night when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. As soon as he died, RFK Jr. came out and said, Thane Eugene Caesar was the assassin of my father, based on my research. And he has it. He understands exactly what took place there. That's huge, because people have always waited for the Kennedys to go public with this, because it really hasn't suited them going along with the establishment record, because the establishment continued. We all know that JFK Jr.'s death was very, very suspect. And they're very worried in that deeply, deeply entrenched area of power of letting the Kennedys back in there, because the Kennedys are all about freedom and kind of pulling people up. And if they get in charge, or if that kind of dynasty gets back in, then it's problematic even now. So I do feel like that was an incredible point that RFK Jr. made, and it took incredible courage to do it. It makes a huge difference to the type of work that we do here, because we do work in the independent media on one level, and if there are these other researchers who are family related on the Kennedy side doing it, and those two worlds meet, then it gives us a much greater basis to demand accountability from the government, which no one has got over the past 56 years. And in the case of RFK, 51 years, it'll be 52 years in June of this year. So absolutely fascinating. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here on MLK Day and remembering that MLK had a fantastic message of empowerment and rebuke for social policies that didn't serve the average citizen, and that unleashed war around the world. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program, and Miss Olivia is going to be putting those together, and you can ask them all in caps now even, and she's just going to put them aside and ask them.
I already have the ultimate question to end with. Thank you. To end, I know
you can
how
do
I'm
it now, and
show.
that could mess up the entire timeline. No, you do. If you want to ask one that's not the ultimate question, you can do that.
Ooh, do I just go for it? Okay, I'm going to go for it.
Okay.
Why wait? Okay, so Shamanist Anamkara wants to know, who does the head of the CIA report to? Off-world beings?
Well, that's $64,000 million question. I would say that this much is true, and I think it has to be looked at, and it comes together in my conversations with Professor Peter Dale Scott, whose work I recommend if you really want to understand the situation that we're in. I always recommend Catherine Austin Fitz, who's a frequent guest on this program, Dr. Joseph Farrell, another frequent guest on this program, and Professor Peter Dale Scott, who has done a series of interviews with me here on this. And I think the kind of greatest overview outline is the one that's called the Doomsday Network, which is all about the continuity of government forces. And that aspect of government has to be understood, because it's a secret corridor of power, which does have some kind of a trail that we can look to. When people walk around and write books talking about the cabal or something, it doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't. Because, you might as well just say crime world. It doesn't, what are you talking about? And then very often a lot of those kind of presenters will say, here's the cabal, and by the way, here's this imaginary white hat alliance who's fighting them, but without any concrete evidence for any of it. So what good does that do anyone? Except if you're a good science fiction writer, it's pretty good. But with Professor Scott's work, it's very simple. Professor Scott did the work over 4 decades. He identified, first of all, the deep state. He coined the term for American political interaction. 2, Professor Scott brought in continuity of government, which was a group that could assume tremendous powers because they were in charge of what would happen in the event of a nightmare scenario of the government being taken out initially in a nuclear holocaust. But then after a while, they changed that in the 80s under the Reagans to be, just in case of an emergency. It's a way to kind of assume martial law. And it was, in fact, exercised during 9/11, which is a point that he makes very often, and that we are still under the 9/11 COG rules of emergency now. Because every year when they do that NDAA, signing off on those emergency powers, which give them the ability to do a number of unlawful things, they have to sign that as part of the NDAA, or else the money doesn't go out and the military doesn't get funded and all the rest. So we have a very interesting situation there, which is the Constitution is in competition with this continuity of government group. Now, there's an episode that we did, it's X series episode 77. Yes, I think it's the one, January 10th, just recently. I did on continuity of government, and that'll kind of get you up to speed on that. I always recommend Professor Scott's book, The American Deep State. But see, we have a handle on this now, so we can actually point to it. There's a trail, and we don't have to imagine a cabal. We can actually point to the continuity of government people and the powers that they seize. Now, the thing that I've been trying to add in all of this is that those continuity of government rules were somehow hijacked and turned into space rules, which is where you got the secret space program and how they were able to do all these things in space for many years without any accountability or congressional oversight. There's a lot of things about the secret space program. We've covered it many times on this program. One of the things I want to point out is fundamentally, one good piece of evidence that came up through all this was when Gary McKinnon, who was a NASA hacker, logged in there to NASA's computers and found an off-world officers list, which listed all these officers who were associated with the program. Now, at this point, they're getting into, kind of going to have to disclose some of that. But what's weird is, we're into 1972 back there. It's the last time we went to the moon. Here we are, 2020. That's 48 years apart, and they're talking about going back in 2024. What happened to 52 years in between there? I mean, it's quite ironic if you think about it. And then we start to look at this and say, well, are you just going to start like Apollo just happened and just, forget about all the stuff in between and not tell us about it? So when we compare that with the information that we've had come forward from Catherine Austin Fitts about the missing trillions from places like DOD, when they start to talk about spending all this money on the Space Force and $740 billion for this National Defense Authorization for 1 year of military activity, I don't think so. When we get into those places, we need to push back. I don't care what part of the political aisle that you're from. Of course, the Democrats are dead set against Trump anyway, and they set up this false thing about impeachment. Yes, absolutely. However, if the Trump administration wants all these, trillions of dollars for the military and wants to militarize space, then his own base has to stop him, because that's a mistake. And he is becoming, he will become the imperialist warmonger that we already had our time with the Bushes, and what all of Trump's enemies have trumped him up to be. So this is the nature of a very tricky political situation that we're in. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We have to kind of set up the scene here about what's happening with all this and how it impacts us now. Here, I'm going to dive into something very, very interesting, and it is in relation to President Nixon's network. Before I do that, I'm going to remind you to go to the Dark Journalist website, darkjournalist.com, and sign up for the newsletter. Just use the newsletter link and get in there and make sure that you are signed up. You will get a newsletter every Friday letting you know what shows are coming up. And that way, none of the shadow banning in the world can stop that thing from coming through. And we'll have that kind of pipeline with each other. We know the social media networks, they're there. They're iffy, though, and they get into shadow banning, and we've seen all kinds of things where, I can't tell you how many times people write to me and they say, well, I liked your video, I subscribed to this, and then I'm unsubscribed, and, the like doesn't show up anymore. What do you call that? That is obviously an algorithm that's just getting rid of it. So we have to make sure that we have our own lines of communication. The newsletter is really the best way to do that. Yes.
So I'd like to ask you this question right now. Renner Newton wants to know, do you not think it's already militarized space? This is a question that is serious and keeps coming up.
Well, it very well could be. The problem is on the record versus off the record. So you have the black budget activity, yes. So if there are things that are happening that we don't know about and can't prove, then it's hard for us to say anything about them. There are large indications that that's taking place, like the missing trillions. That's on the record because Professor Mark Skidmore joined with former Housing Secretary Catherine Austin Fitts to do that. Now they're a united front, and the press couldn't ignore what she was saying. I mean, they've done a pretty good job of ignoring this or spinning it anyway. But what they did, and what she points out so crucially, starting in 2019, is FASB 56, which actually is spelled FASAB 56. I don't know why it's not just called FASAB 56. This is some dull marketing. But FASB 56 allows those governments, those different agencies of government, to take black information on the accounting side that they feel exposes them, so that they have the ability to go confidential with it. It is, in a way, a law, a rule that allows FASB 56 to basically take the whole government dark. It's quite remarkable. So she feels that it's very fascist in this sense. When you have all the missing money and then they're introducing FASB 56, it seems the combination of those two leads to the idea that there's a gigantic sucking sound, as Ross Perot used to say about jobs. But this is money that's disappearing, and you have to ask, especially at those levels, into what? So if you have $20 trillion, which she actually estimates as a much larger, but at least they can prove that much, and that's just DOD and HUD, then you have to ask yourself a question: where is that money going? And so the idea of a space program that's been under development in those 50 years since we went to the moon, and then afterwards said, oh, we're not going to the moon anymore, and there's no more manned flights. We'll just have these shuttles once in a while. This gets into a deep, deep, deep exotic technology arena. And I'm going to debut a term on this program tonight I'm going to show how this relates to exotic technology and X technology. The word is barrier technology. Barrier technology is what resides inside of the UFO file. That's the X technology. And I'm going to explain here what barrier technology is as we get into it. But first, I'm going to go to something very interesting, which will give us kind of the thread of how we get to where we're going. There was something back there in NASA's history called the Space Task Group. The Space Task Group was able to split off from NASA and work on separate projects, and this is where we're going to find the most interesting UFO file characters. It also allows them to work in a clandestine fashion for a very public agency. One of the key people around all this is someone whose name was Thomas O. Paine, and he served as NASA's administrator under President Nixon. He's going to come up as a very major figure here tonight. This is a shot of him with Nixon. And again, his name, Thomas O. Paine. Interestingly enough, he quotes the actual Thomas Paine from the Revolutionary War times. And he, it's just an interesting thing that you'll see in these documents, all these quotes from Thomas Paine, the Thomas Paine. Well, this is Thomas O. Paine, and his dad was a Commodore in the Navy, and he seems to have kind of been born into a very secret environment, and he was a very interesting, high-ranking administrator and scientist. And under his time with NASA, he was in charge of everything up to Apollo 8, which is quite remarkable. And then he, of course, under Nixon, Apollo 11, he was the head honcho. Now, one of the things that he was in charge of, which is quite interesting, is the Apollo 11 Goodwill messages. This is very important because Nixon's penchant for time capsules and putting things away goes back to his time as the VP of Eisenhower. And I've pointed this out in Tesla, Trump, and the time capsule, so I won't reiterate it all here, but I will say this, which is that President Eisenhower kept something called the X Time Capsule. It's a 100-year time capsule that he set up in 1953 And when they asked him about the contents, he said some of the contents refer to Vice President Nixon, which I thought was very unusual. But this is at his ranch there up in Pennsylvania, and that's not to be opened until 2053. Now, LBJ kept something which was an X letter, and which still resides at his library, and this is the LBJX letter to be opened in 2023. Okay, that's 3 years from now. They opened part of it in 1994 after Nixon died because they thought it was related to the political battles between them. And they found a little bit of reference to that, but some unusual things and things they instantly had to classify, and then they didn't look at the other 14 pages. So it gives you some idea. Again, I've referred to these as stealth archives because they detail these presidents and major figures' work around the UFO file before that is revealed. So when the time comes and that's revealed, people can go back and say, oh, you were the one who was in charge of it from here to here, and here's what you did. And there's a number of these that go all the way back to JFK, but certainly go through the Reagan era. And what rose out of so much of that was that they were using this X steganography, which is what we track on this program. And the X steganography, just a quick overview on it. For example, the major space project during the Clinton era was the X-33. And this project just disappeared. And this is how the X projects go. But it was basically the most advanced, kind of X-37B of its era. And it never was fully accomplished, but that the X-33 representing the kind of X steganography of the 90s space program, what they were building in. And the X programs date all the way back to Walter Dornberger's work on the technological side, and Dornberger was von Braun's boss when they were in Nazi Germany. So I pointed this out. I think what's important to the takeaway from it is that they used in these secret programs this X steganography to move secret projects through government agencies that had to be done in some kind of public fashion while keeping its true purpose hidden. And they used something that was very old. I've done many shows on how the mystery schools used X steganography, and that goes all the way back to Egyptian times. So the groups that would have access to those types of things are those kind of secret societies. And also Masonic tradition has access to that type of symbolism. So X steganography, I've seen so many examples of it, and I've pointed out so many examples in some 80-odd episodes here, that it's a key, really, for us when we look at these things. So now the Goodwill message. The Goodwill message was put on a disk. It was a silicon chip that was developed especially for this purpose under President Nixon. Let's take a look at the chip first, which was pretty advanced for its era. Designed right here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, by the way. No big surprise there. This is the original advanced circuit board of 1969. And the size of it was only that big. Wow. You can see that that's a Kennedy $50 there.
Mm-hmm. From planet Earth. Wow.
Now we have 73 world leaders saying, we're going to keep space a peaceful domain, and by the way, welcome to the galaxy, and all of these things. And this was placed in a white pouch and put on the moon, just left behind there. But it was a major project that Thomas O. Paine had undertaken, and there's a reason for that. I'm going to read just some kind of the basic details about this Apollo 11 Goodwill message and the silicon disk that went with it. Now, the Apollo 11 Goodwill messages are statements from the leaders of 73 countries around the world on a disk about the size of a 50-cent piece, which we were just looking at, made of silicon that was left on the moon by Apollo 11 astronauts. The disk also carried names of the leadership of Congress, the 4 committees of the House and Senate responsible for legislation related to the NASA administration, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. This is interesting, too, because for some reason, the members and the overseers of HUD are on there. And someone has to explain that to me. That's quite unusual. top management, including past administrators and deputy administrators. At the top of the disc is the inscription, Goodwill messages from around the world brought to the moon by the astronauts of Apollo 11. Around the rim is the statement, from planet Earth, July 1969. The disc was manufactured by Sprague Electric Company of North Adams, Massachusetts. NASA head Thomas O. Paine proposed the idea to the U.S. State Department. Actually, it was Nixon's idea, and he collaborated with him and corresponded with world leaders to solicit their message. These were enshrined by being photographed and reduced to 1/200th scale ultra microfiche silicon etching. The disc rests in an aluminum case on the moon's Sea of Tranquility.
Mm.
The disc was in a package in Buzz Aldrin's suit shoulder pocket, along with some other memorial items. He was reminded about the package by Neil Armstrong while ascending the ladder to finish their visit. He then dropped it to the surface. Later, Houston requested and received confirmation that they had placed it. Now, Nixon did a couple of very interesting things for this. He wanted his name to appear on this and on a plaque that was on the leg of the lander without the M. So it would just say Richard Nixon. It wouldn't say Richard M. Nixon, President Richard M. Nixon. It's very unusual because his middle name was Milhouse. And removing the M from this, I found kind of fascinating. And it's going to pay off here later.
Okay.
Now, Payne's close associate at NASA and his kind of major partner over there was Werner von Braun. And von Braun had gone through this amazing transformation of being a Nazi SS scientist, of working with Walter Dornberger, who was an ARC Nazi, and who actually was somebody who was set up to kind of be hanged there as part of the Nuremberg trials. But they decided, because von Braun needed him so desperately, to save him. And scientists are going to play kind of a big role in all this as we get along. One more shot at this. The Goodwill message silicon chip. Basically like a small CD left there on the moon's surface. Now, Payne himself was incredibly innovative around space stations. He wanted a colony on Mars, and he laid this out perfectly in the public. And he said by 1979, we can have a space station and a presence on Mars. This is where he was heading. This is 1969. So he's talking within a decade they can do that. So the question immediately becomes, if this guy who's the leader of NASA thinks they can do that, what happened to it? We're going to try to answer some of those questions tonight. He found in Nixon someone who he felt was very secretive, and someone who obviously had shared some things with him that he never went on the record about. So, but Nixon really tried to guide him publicly in terms of his statements, and they developed a pretty close relationship. But you can tell when you read his interviews about Nixon, he's giving that impression that, yeah, you know, there placed a lot of restriction on what he could do. Now, when we get into this message, it gets very, very unusual. I'm going to read a little bit about it. Within a few feet of the first boot print made on the moon, under the ladder on which a U.S. flag was stowed and a commemorative plaque is still attached, lies a small white cloth pouch. Inside that bag, next to a couple of embroidered emblems, medals, and a gold olive branch, is a small case. Contained within that thin metal sheath is a silicon disc about the size of a $50 coin. Etched onto that disc in letters no larger than 1/4 the width of a human hair are 73 messages. Such an item, as small as it is, hidden as it was, could be mistaken as insignificant and easily forgotten, and it almost was twice. And there's been a book about this which details the story of the whole thing. But one of the interesting things that he mentioned is that there was a plaque affixed to Apollo 11's lander leg, and it read in part, "We come in peace or we came in peace for all mankind. This is a very important thing for us to remember what the space program is about, which is it's not about dominance in space, and it's not about space as a war-fighting domain. Whoever has changed the narrative there that the Trump administration is using now, and which the rest of the government seems content to go along with and rave on about because they know the money that's involved, are literally throwing the mandate of space exploration out the window. And it's very important that we not let them do that. And I'm going to get into why. So we get into, there's a lot of technical details with this, but I'm going to try to get right to the core of it. In 1985, years after Apollo, years after Payne was the leader of NASA, the Reagan administration called him back into activity, which I find interesting. They chose Thomas Paine to chair a National Commission on Space to prepare a report on the future of space exploration. Since leaving NASA 15 years earlier, Paine had been a tireless spokesman for an expansive view of what should be done in space. The Paine Commission took most of a year to prepare its report. That is called Pioneering the Space Frontier. And it contains something called the Declaration for Space, which we're going to cover tonight also. It's very important that the United States has a declaration for space. We also have an agreement on behalf of the Congress and the President, going back to Eisenhower, to develop in space only for peaceful purposes, not that it's not a war-fighting domain. So many of these things have to be addressed by this new group of people coming into this and looking at the space program for the first time. Now, one interesting thing about Thomas O. Paine and his connections beyond being the NASA administrator for Nixon was that he actually was somebody who was part of a group called Sigma Xi. Sigma Xi is a very important society for scientists, and it contained some of the most incredible names on its roster, like Einstein, for example. But one of the more interesting ones I found on there was Jack Parsons. And there's a lot of rocketry specialists associated with it. Scientific Research Honor Society. And one of the interesting things I found about that is there's no real good explanation for why it's XI in there. And I feel like the X-steganography is deep in the society. The more you look into it, it certainly is. But it is Sigma Xi. One of the interesting, notable alumni that Thomas O. Paine met when he was there, and I have the list of the Sigma Xi members here, was John von Neumann. Now, it's pretty interesting because when we think about von Neumann, as we pointed out here in this program, he's the person who took over the UFO file. So he's a major physicist. He was involved in the Manhattan Project, and he's really associated with the success of that program and atomic energy in general. He died young at the age of 53, and then his young assistant, who he married, his wife, she died under unusual circumstances, diving off a pier at midnight in San Diego. Mm. So obviously there were things that she knew that after his death, they didn't want just hanging around there. I won't go through all the names that are on here, but definitely very impressive group. But let's just focus on John von Neumann for a moment. Von Neumann is the person that was identified by Dr. Robert Sarbarker, who was the physicist who was really a top physicist, and he's been deleted by history, as I've pointed out many times on this program. And he doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. It's quite remarkable. This guy, his main crime against humanity is that he went out and talked to UFO researchers in the early 80s, shortly before his death. He did have a suspicious death, and that's Sarbarker, and we're going to find that he's associated with a group that I refer to here as X-Share. And I'm going to explain this a little bit, that in working with this X technology, you have two groups. It's very clear. One group is X-Protect, and they will protect the dominance of that technology through lethal means. And so all those stories about the men in black, that all comes out of XProtect. All those stories that have to do with witnesses being silenced or scientists being disappeared and things like that is all XProtect in order to keep and maintain the superiority when it comes to handling that kind of UFO X technology. Now, XShare is a group that we've seen parallel with them side by side, and we see these groups fight very often. And it's interesting to try to identify them through history because it becomes easy after a while. And certainly the XShare people, you could look at people like Thomas Townsend Braun, for example, who was very uncomfortable with the levels of secrecy around that. James Forrestal, for example, was very close to President Kennedy when he was set in charge, one of the main figures in the Majestic group that was overseeing the UFO file. He was uncomfortable with it to the point where they had to get rid of him after a very short stint as the first defense secretary by throwing him out of a window at Bethesda Naval Hospital.
Can I announce something to the group?
Yes.
Okay, so PD Pablo 2 says, are you aware Trump just tweeted, quote, United States of America, we are now #1 in the universe, by far, the universe.
Oh,
Why am I not surprised?
Well, it makes the case that he found the Nixon time capsule. We're going to go into the time capsule as soon as we understand what this Goodwill message is about. That's pretty good, though. And I do want to remind you, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Here we're in X Series episode 79. We're going deep on the presidents and their connection to this X technology. And it's a great crowd tonight for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And, it's an interesting thing to reflect on his career and the incredible things that he accomplished using very nonviolent methods. But there's nothing that can stop the spread of a good idea from spreading like wildfire, even a very repressive government. And that's what he taught us. So under very difficult circumstances, he changed the world. And I think he's a fantastic role model for us in this sense. And this will be now the 52nd anniversary of his assassination. It's interesting to note that he was in conversation with Robert Kennedy shortly before his death and was set to promote Kennedy's candidacy. And there are rumors that he was set to become Kennedy's VP, RFK's VP back then, which would have been quite a radical move. And if they were tapping his phone and listening to those conversations, they would have known that. So it's quite remarkable when you think about it. Kennedy would die 2 months later. So you can imagine the fractured world of American politics in 1968. And, whenever I go back and I look at these PBS specials and things, they bring out like a Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she's like, she talks to these kind of white liberals who think that they accomplished all these things. It's very interesting to me because when you look at it, there's no addressing the fact that there was a real civil war that took place in the 60s and that traditional overt government lost to covert government. That is what Professor Scott refers to as the deep state. That overtook the government that was trying to do something good on the surface. So when the Kennedys and the Kings got too powerful and commanded too much of the public attention, they literally, their decision wasn't to try to discredit them. They literally just had to eliminate them. And this is what came out of that. So when they talk about the 60s very often, they're always about, hey, look at all the things we accomplished, without really saying what they lost there. And, by losing those leaders, it wasn't just like, oh, wasn't it a shame? What a terrible time. No, it's that there was a deep state active going parallel with the regular government that took out those leaders because they didn't want the competition. And unfortunately, you're still dealing with those factors today. So that type of reporting is always interesting to me. But in any case, I do think that MLK and the things that he represented is something that we should celebrate as Americans and around the world, because we can get those types of changes using very nonviolent methods. And that's all about being informed, which is why the media and journalism is so important, because we've seen it over and over again. We were just talking about those incredible riots and things going on in France, incredibly underreported. And that's just it. If you don't report it and people don't understand that it's happening, then there can't be any ripple effect, right? You shut it off at the source. And that's what happens with secrecy, too, with the wall of secrecy that we see going on here relating to the UFO file. So these presidents and these ex-share versus ex-protect groups have gone through this process of fighting it out, trying to move this forward. Now, Nixon had gone very far towards being the UFO disclosure president. He had actually funded documentaries that would, this is the whole Robert Emmenegger story, and they actually came out, but they were diminished from what they were originally going to be. And they were all about UFOs, past and present, and they were getting the DoD to open up about those. What I found truly fascinating about that work is when you look at Nixon, he understood the UFO file because under Eisenhower, as VP, he oversaw something called CIA Project Blue Book, which is the real Project Blue Book. The public got the junk conspiracy version, whitewash version of Project Blue Book, and the traditional one where they said, oh, it's swamp gas or whatever. But it just had to look like an honest exercise. In the meantime, they're looking at the real thing and not dealing with the public on it. But the split in those two positions has become so schizophrenic for society at large that what's happened is all sides know that there's some kind of disclosure around this that's taking place. It's just in the recognition of people's minds. So what they're trying to do now, we've actually seen marketing groups that are CIA controlled, like TTSA, for example. We've done a number of shows on them and just exposed their board as, they say it openly that it's all a bunch of CIA people. But the CIA has tremendous influence on the media. So they can get that through and put up a guy like Elizondo who had nothing to do with running this, advanced aerial threat identification program. Even the Pentagon says, well, he never ran it. And they just promote this guy who's a COINTEL CIA agent, and because they have a narrative. And they've got Tom DeLonge as a bobo. They use this operation. This is how they move that forward. So their version of the UFO thing had a lot of UFO enthusiasts saying, hey, we're finally getting something on UFOs. And they were so desperate for anything from the government that they were accepting the CIA junk, which was all about creating a threat program to get more money to fight a threat. It's very, very different than opening up to the idea that there are other off-world civilizations. It's so different that, when some people say, well, at least it's something. No, it's not. It's like saying, if somebody says, well, I have a cure for cancer, and somebody says, well, look, it's a fake cure and it doesn't cure anybody. What are you talking about? And then someone else comes along and says, well, at least he said he had a cure for cancer. I mean, I don't understand the mentality around that. And the groups like the TTSA that have sprung up, really, the only thing that does is it raises the level that they're getting into position to do something with this. And again, they're creating, what's the main thing that they're pushing there? It's threat. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Okay, so this is a perfect opportunity for me to ask this question. Conscious for now, are you not concerned Trump is surrounded by end times believing evangelical advisors and voters, has access to XTech by Nixon, his own uncle, to present himself as savior in fake rapture/ET invasion? Elizondo said UAPs could be of religious significance. Why would he say that? Was Trump appeasing end times evangelicals? It's an intriguing question.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you though. First of all, UAP is junk.
We can't stand that.
Just forget about UAP. That's not the term. Is UFO. That's it. UAP was something that was conjured up and created so they could rebrand this and have TTSA pictures all over bad UFO footage that they were putting out there and being like, well, look, the government is opening up about this. So Elizondo is a counterintelligence CIA agent, so anything that he has to say, I look at in terms of his position. He's a counterintelligence operative. What does a counterintelligence operative do? They lie. And the fact that they kept him so long in that position says to me that he's an extremely good liar. So no, that's not somebody I'm going to look to. I think when you're a Republican and you are in the White House, you have to go for that conservative bloc as a vote because you have so many different forces against you. Whether we're talking about Reagan or Bush, they all had to go for that. Back in the Reagan era, it was Jerry Falwell. Who was it in the Bush era? But it was Billy Graham, maybe. So they all go for that. That's just part of what you do. Just like when you're the Democratic candidate, you have to go for those more liberal causes, more on the stuff on the left for their support, even if you don't really share their vision. I don't see Trump as much of a religious guy at all, considering the life that he's led. I think he has some depth, and
I think he has serious magic.
Magic.
Yes.
That's interesting. Well, I'll tell you, they're ruining his magic by making him go after other countries and militarizing space. So it's problematic. And this is the thing. Remember, you can go in with a mandate and you can really want to do things well. But if you get the military in your ear and they say, if you're imperialist, you can get a lot more money and you can dominate the world and move your vision forward. And by the way, we can take all those countries and on a fast program, make them into democratic republics. Actually, what you get is the Iraq War for 10 years and then the 2008 fiscal crash, which takes everybody to the cliff of financial ruin. So don't believe the hype. A guy like Trump, it's very interesting, and we'll address him on this. You mentioned that Trump's uncle, the show that we did, Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule. Now, we outlined for everyone over a year and a half ago that John Trump was a central figure in the UFO file because not only was he the person that got called in to look at Tesla's papers, which is crucial that they would call him, but why did they call him to do it? The reason they called him to do it is because his mentor was the head of the National Scientific Group that under FDR, and his protege, that's Vannevar Bush, who was the mentor, his protege was Professor John Trump. That's why they sent him in to review those papers. One of the unusual things that he said they were looking for was the ability to down flying objects at a distance. Say, if I'm in Hawaii and I want to shoot something down over the UK. So it's quite remarkable when we think about this, because what was happening there was just 2 years later, they adopted the acronym UFO, which is unidentified flying object. So the question is that what they were really looking for there in Tesla's papers? I mean, I'm sure there was a lot to find. And one of the stories he recounts was that the agents that he was with, who were two FBI guys, they went and hid behind some pillars there while he went into this hotel safe and opened up the suitcase because they thought there was a death ray or something in there. I was going to take out the whole building. Dr. John Trump is very enigmatic. He lived in Watertown, which is maybe like 10 minutes from here. And he was a professor at MIT. And one of the things that I found when I was looking for his papers at MIT was that they were all in box X. So that trailer, of X-steganography. And so it goes. Not that there was anything in that box that was going to help us with his papers in terms of identifying secret X technology, but it is, I think, significant as a router, as an indicator, again, that they internally will use it because they know what it means. For us, it's just another letter of the alphabet. But John Trump is significant in this sense, which is that Vannevar Bush, as his mentor, was in charge of the UFO file. Therefore, that's Vannevar Bush there. We have to remember also that Vannevar Bush was in charge of the MIT Mason Lodge. So when we think about it that way, then we have a whole different situation going on because he's aware mystically on one hand, but he also knows how to handle secrecy. So the X-steganography that gets placed around the UFO issue makes a lot of sense, actually, when you put those two together. But that connection, which had not come up before when we were doing those reports, it just was not out there. And I'd never heard anyone mention it. One of the things that I found fascinating about it was this is a direct link to Trump having knowledge about that UFO file right away going in, which is maybe why they were going so bananas in the first few years to get rid of him. And they still have this kind of false impeachment thing. Now, I think what they may have determined is we can't get him under traditional ways. So what we're going to do instead is appeal to his arrogance and tell him that he can take over, Middle East countries and it'll be easy, or he can militarize space or whatever. And so that imperialism is creeping in, and if it doesn't creep back, then it's going to undo anything that he was trying to do. There's no question about it. But I think when we have to consider Trump in that. Remember, when we were identifying these groups, that is that shot there of Kennedy visiting Forrestal's grave. We have to think about people who handle X technology. If you're in the government and you're aware of an advanced technology, it's a totally different situation that you're in than if you have just a regular public position. And so these scientists have kept this kind of oath of secrecy around this. One of the things that Tsar Barker did, and one of the reasons he was erased so heavily, was that he came out and talked about, yes, one, on the record, we did redevelop and re-engineer UFO technology from crash retrievals. It's very important because there's a lot of rumors about it, but there is one of the highest ranking physicists in the country. He was right up there with Oppenheimer at the time, who was confirming it in the early 80s. So therefore, we don't have to go theoretical on that anymore. He even identified the chain of command and who took over after the fact. Arthur, there's a variety of people that he mentioned, Arthur Compton and Eric Compton, but then when we get to John von Neumann, it's quite fascinating, and that brings us back to our friend who we're talking about here, Thomas O. Paine. Now, Paine having access to von Neumann, and then Nixon working with him to get these kind of silicon chip on the moon, I think gives us an indication again of this depositing of history. So they put something up there. Traditionally, and how we understand it, is they put 73 countries and their kind of goodwill messages up there. But I think it's pretty legitimate to think, where's the best place to keep very, very hidden information? The moon is a pretty good place to do it, and then to say it's up there and we can get it. So I find this penchant for time capsules quite fascinating coming out of Nixon. And it gives us, by the time we get to the Merritt story, it gives us some of that background. We start to understand it. This is a shot of Nixon with Thomas O. Paine. In the background is Spiro Agnew, who became the head of the Space Task Force for Nixon. And what's really interesting is that the conversations that took place between Paine and Agnew also are quite fascinating. One of the things that was in the X letter from the LBJ library was the fact that LBJ was trailing Spiro Agnew, and they had trailed him to New Mexico. So that struck me as very interesting. Like, what exactly were you expecting him to do, and why were you mentioning this? So, but we'll answer that in another show. What we have here, I think, with Paine is somebody who's in that link of the chain of the X technology, coming out of Sigma XI, which is where we have so many of these colorful figures who are leading the UFO file. On one hand, like John von Neumann, and then these other figures who are a little more, kind of chaotic, chaos magic rocket engineers like Jack Parsons. He's also part of that society. So we can see then what he has access to in his circle. Suddenly, as a character, he starts to show up very differently. And the fact that he's there working for Nixon as his administrator. Now, I want to touch on Reagan and how this relates to the knowledge that Nixon had. And I think this is very crucial. Well, we started the program off by talking about the Nixon UFO time capsule that Robert Merritt gave as his final testament before he passed away. And he gave it as an exclusive on this show, giving us some idea about his clandestine work for the Nixon administration, and then the fact that Nixon had shared that after Watergate, he was putting aside this information and hiding it in the White House that related to the UFO file. And as we pointed out, this also involves the year 2020. Now, this is very interesting and let's take a quick look at this. Transcript release detailing CIA briefing President Reagan on alien encounters.
Another man with great hair.
Reagan, I have to tell you, is a very important figure he's kind of ignored in some ways, except for a few kind of quotes that he made at the UN about aliens. But I think the fact that Gorbachev came off and said in front of Kissinger and all these other people at the press club in New York to Charlie Rose back in 2017 that, Reagan took him aside and said, if there is any kind of an alien invasion, will you help us? He was getting briefings that were steering some of the UFO file information into a war thing, which is what they're trying to do with the public right now. But anyway, let's take a quick look at this. And like I said, it comes out of that milieu of kind of like the MJ-12 style documents. That is, it's hard to pin down and substantiate, but I want to pull a couple of things out of it anyway. Now, in the transcript, William Casey, who's the head of the CIA, is giving him this briefing, and he says, "Mr. President, good morning, as we discussed in February." Oh, that's one thing I want to mention about this before we go any further, is that UFO researchers who have looked at this, it has incredible detail to it, which is why they've taken it so seriously. In terms of the facts of the people who were at those meetings, their background, and what they were speaking about. So I'm inclined to give it that much credit that those researchers have looked at it and said this would be a tough one to fake. So as he's talking about it, he says, "As you'll see, Mr. President, this stuff is pretty high up on the food chain. We call it above top secret. This stuff has its own classification and markings. We have a special container, printers, and copiers for this stuff. Every word of this material is printed on special paper and then placed inside special covers." Starting to get an idea of Nixon's message there, too. The caretakers have taken special efforts to protect all of this from being released inadvertently or copied by some unauthorized person. Now, Reagan responds to him because he's talking about the UFO file. And Reagan says, I should do my Reagan accent. Well, I knew, they actually put well in there. Well, I knew a little about this subject before. Back in 1970, Nixon had all of the good stuff and wanted to share it with some of his friends. Nixon showed me some papers, not sure about who authored them, but they, well, let's say something about New Mexico and other places. Nixon was pretty well, fascinated with it. He showed me something, a kind of object or device that came from one of their craft, something that was taken from New Mexico crash site. I don't know if we knew what it was. I do think we knew, or maybe now after 11 years, we might know. So there's all this other stuff that goes in there. The only thing I want to grab out of that conversation is that he's saying Nixon had a tendency to want to talk about this, show it off, showed him a piece. Now, at the time, Reagan was just the governor of California. So it wasn't part of the Nixon administration. But Nixon would send him on Goodwill peace missions and things like that, and he used him as a courier of government information. So this is something very, very interesting, I think, when we look at it, because we all have in the classic history around Nixon this classic story about Jackie Gleason's wife saying that, they were very close friends, Gleason and Nixon, and that to show off, in essence, he took him to an air base in Florida, Homestead, and he showed him alien bodies. I tend to take all of that very seriously, actually, because Gleason was a very, very intense fanatic around UFOs. As we know, he had one of the largest UFO libraries that there were. So therefore, when we're looking at that, again, with what Reagan says in that briefing, Nixon's showing him something. He's kind of putting him in the loop, and he's giving him this information. Merritt told a very similar story. Merritt, after all, was just a courier. There was no reason to actually tell him what he was carrying. But Nixon, again, had worked with him, and he thought of him as someone who he could trust, and he wanted to, in a sense, brag. it's a very interesting thing that this shows up over and over again when we get around Nixon and dealing with this. It's like on the UFO side, he had a plan to make it public, and he was starting to tell people about it and getting that feeling of what happens when I talk about this. Now, Nixon had developed a disclosure documentary, as I pointed out, and he had also put together plans for running for a third term, according to Robert Merritt. This is very interesting, but we have to put ourselves in the mindset of that period of time. There was a large-scale crisis that related to Arab oil and how they were shutting off the oil. So the idea of developing an alternative energy source was kind of like the ultimate card that he held to get him out of the Watergate mess and everything else. So interestingly enough, there are reports in newspapers in Australia at that time saying that Pine Gap was where Nixon was developing this incredible alternative energy. Now, it's interesting because in Merritt's story, as Nixon is reading this letter, one of the things he has in there is an energy formula. And the energy formula is something that's supposed to be transformative. And, you know, it would make basically the United States energy independent. So it's quite remarkable when you think about it. The whole story starts to come together when we look at different factors around it. Now, what's interesting is Pine Gap would become very well known as the Australian Area 51. And it was developed and created under LBJ. And what happened was there was the original Australian Prime Minister who was working with them. He had an unusual accident when he objected to the fact of us having troops in Vietnam. So there, you know, we lost our big Pine Gap partner there. But later, there was a prime minister named Gough Whitlam who was actually removed by the Queen of England through the Governor General. And this is very important because you don't make those types of extreme moves unless something major is going on. And so what was happening there was they needed to keep Pine Gap going because they were doing this alternative UFO research a la Area 51, but it was even beyond the reach of Nevada. I mean, this is really Australia. You know, that's hard for anyone in America to get at, to get any secrets out of. So they had been able to pull this off. Gough Whitlam, and the way he describes the story over the years is interesting because he was saying, because of the American pressure on us, we're booting them out of Pine Gap. And that's when they got rid of him. So it's an extraordinary constitutional crisis that happens extraordinarily right after the Nixon constitutional crisis. So it seems like, you know what, these people who are kind of assuming the role of ex-share, like Nixon and Gough Whitlam, they're moving to do this disclosure around this independent energy. And it's related to the UFO file. I don't think there's any question about it. Both of them are thrown out of office within a year of each other under unusual circumstances, let's face it. So we have to kind of look at these things and kind of get our minds wrapped around what we're talking about when we're getting into areas like disclosure and alternative energy and secrecy, because it comes into a totally different place when you start to see it for what it really is. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep, deep here in X Series 79. This is Stealth UFO Archives. We're talking about the connections here for the XTech through the presidency. And we're looking at JFK and Nixon and Reagan and Trump. This forms an unbreakable chain, as it were. We're taking your questions in the second part of the program. It's coming up very soon. Make sure you ask them in all caps.
All caps.
Miss Olivia, how's it going out there?
It's actually a little trolly tonight. I'm trying to stay focused and keep the vibe high.
Do I have to do my look?
No,
if you're someone from a 3-letter agency and you're using a 4-letter word, then you're going to face a 5-star spam general right now down the line. How are the questions going?
The questions are all over the place.
Okay, well, you can throw one at me now, so I'm going to switch over.
Well, you know, I wanted to ask this. Liberty Thunder wanted to know, does DJ suspect John Trump and those that sent John Trump knew his nephew Donald was going to be president at some point in the future? There's always this rumor around
I know.
that about time travel tech.
Well, see, here's the thing. There's there's a very interesting German painter named Delschow, and he was part of something called the Sonora Aero Club, and he came up in the work of Walter Bosley, and there's a series of paintings that he does where he uses that name Trump, and he shows these various airships and things, and then it's the 45 series. Now, Trump is the 45th president of the United States. So this was all taking place now, we're going back to the turn of the last century, sometime around the 1900. So, and we were lucky to even find Delschau's information at all. It actually was all going to be burned in an attic and lost, but it just so happened it made its way to a thrift store and someone picked it up. And now you can go and check out his very unusual kind of artistic designs of these airships. And, a lot of those things are way before the Wright brothers, so you wonder about it. One of the most kind of explosive paintings that he made was one that appeared to depict a uranium, a kind of a nuclear reactor. So to be doing that in that period is extraordinary, unless somebody somewhere had access to this advanced tech before it was laid out in the public sense. So Delschow, and I'm going to spell that out, it's Dellschau. There's no question that he did that. Now, is this an internal prediction of his own? Was he some kind of a mystic? Well, it's weird because the Nixon thing comes into a prediction too, where he predicted that 2020 was going to be very cataclysmic, and this is something that he said to Robert Merritt. But I think it is odd that he wrote a letter to Trump and became close with him after the fact, but in the letter that he predicts he's going to be president and win. I think that's unusual. And for me, when he says prediction, we have to remember who had his ear the most when he was in the presidency, and it was not Henry Kissinger, it was Jean Nixon. Mm-hmm. They were close, and the way we found that out the most about her involvement in the administration is really very interesting, because someone who was studying 9/11 and was trying to figure out what was the first terrorist task force, and they went through the records and they saw that it was under Nixon, but they saw this incredible amount of visits from Jean Nixon to the White House. And so she was part of it, and he was using her abilities to prognosticate astrologically, psychically, whatever it was she was doing. And she had done this since FDR. So you see, the presidents have that
Really?
time.
Since FDR?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Absolutely. And FDR got her in there to ask, how long have I got? Mm-hmm. Quite remarkable. But we know, if we go back into this lineage, that it was Edgar Casey who gave Woodrow Wilson a reading in the White House and helped him lay out the famous 14 points. So when we look at that, we can see these presidents, they understand the value of psychic work, and they utilize it. And in the case of Jean Nixon, she may have predicted, using that word prediction in the letter, I think is interesting, because for all we know, he checked in with Jean and she was like, that guy's going to be president, stay close. And it looks to me, since Nixon was such a major figure going back to the 50s on the UFO file, that his close friendship with Trump, which we detailed in Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule, that is, it's undeniable that they had that relationship. The question is, did he share that information, or did they share with each other because Trump knew from his uncle, who he always says he was close to, and we know that Trump's uncle, he had Vannevar Bush as his mentor. Vannevar Bush was the top scientist in the United States, but identified as the man who held the UFO file. He was identified by Robert Sarbarker on the record. That's not an MJ-12 document. He did it in conversation. It's a transcript. So therefore, we know that connection exists. What we are trying to figure out is what Trump is doing with the knowledge and how much of it he has. But it could very well be why he set off so many alarm bells when he got in, and why they just wanted to get rid of him at any cost. But I think if they can use his knowledge to create, the Space Force is really his attempt to say, I'm grabbing back something from the UFO file to put it under the presidential umbrella. This is something that Kennedy tried to do. But the problem is Kennedy wanted peace in space. And Trump's thing is, hey, let's make space a warfighting domain and we'll use high-tech stuff to blow you away. That's, that's a way to set us back dramatically. We don't want to take warlike policies out into space. We established the space program to do the opposite so that war wouldn't get out there. So the idea, there are treaties that were signed onto that don't allow weapons of mass destruction in space. That's a fact. Trump has been breaking treaties. He broke a treaty that went back to Reagan and Gorbachev having to do with the INF treaty, which is the Intermediate Nuclear Missile Treaty and Intermediate Range Treaty, and he scrapped it. Well, we had been working on that treaty for 15 years, and Reagan got it with Gorbachev because he showed him SDI Star Wars and said, we're going to keep going with this, and then you're not going to be able to keep up. So let's bring our nuclear levels down to almost nothing. And they did. They accomplished that, and they stepped back from a tremendous precipice. And for some reason, Trump thinks it's a good idea to throw off all of that and to get back into let's make shiny nuclear arms, probably because it's like an expansive business idea. It's a terrible idea for humanity, and he shows the weakest wisdom in that department. So he needs better, like a sound Secretary of State, not Pompeo, who's a CIA director, and just, look at the guy. He's hell-bent on war, and he looks kind of like a psycho, frankly. I think he acts like a psycho, too. So he needs to be fired immediately. Just get him out of there and get the CIA influence out. I mean, the CIA were the ones who were trying to remove Trump in the first place. If I were him, I would release the JFK records now, put out all the CIA JFK records, and show the CIA up for what they are. That way you'd have leverage over them, and that's what you want to do. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's great to have you here. We're going to take a deep dive now into Reagan and a few interesting comments that came up. I'm going to take your comments here soon. One thing I wanted to mention, too, which is if you want to sign up to be a member of Dark Journalist, now is the time to do it, because we're holding that last year. We did this huge discount just to let people get on board, and we're going to hold that right up to January 31st. So now is the time to do it. And we're going to have incredible benefits coming up for members. Can't mention them all here yet, but there's some really fascinating bonuses that are going to be associated with being a member. So I recommend you do that. Go to Dark Journalist now and get behind the show and the kind of reporting that we're doing on here and the incredible guests that we're going to be bringing forward for you. So we really appreciate that. Now, Steven Spielberg.
Okay.
I want to talk about Space Station Freedom and Steven Spielberg here. And I wanted a really good picture of Spielberg with Reagan. Hold on. I know it's here. There it is. This is Steven Spielberg at the White House with Nancy and Ronald Reagan. And what is he doing? He's setting up to screen E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Now, there's a lot of different things that you can screen at the White House. But to screen E.T. is pretty interesting, obviously. Now, here's an article, which is the Huffington Post. Steven Spielberg, quote, Ronald Reagan said E.T. was real. Let's get into this. Long out of Hollywood, Ronald Reagan may have put his own acting on hold, in the company of a legendary director. In a new interview with Ain't It Cool News, Spielberg, I should be in there if it's Ain't It Cool News. Spielberg details the time he screened his classic film E.T. at the White House for Reagan and distinguished guests in the former president's coy response to the alien epic. Quote, this is Spielberg now. He just stood up and he looked around the room almost like he was doing a head count and said, I wanted to thank you for bringing E.T. to the White House. We really enjoyed your movie. And then he looked around the room and said, and there are a number of people in this room who know that everything on that screen is absolutely true.
Wow.
That's Spielberg, unquote. And Spielberg remembers, and he said it without smiling. So he wasn't joking. He wasn't smiling as he said it. So did he really believe the story? and so and on it goes. But we have all these interesting stories about Reagan and Air Force One chasing UFOs and things like that.
Was that when he was president or when he was?
Well, that was when he was president, but also he was known to arrive. There's a story about him and Nancy Reagan arriving at Lucille Ball's party and showing up and saying, "We just saw a UFO. We chased it in a car basically for the last half hour," and they came into this thing. So they always have this weird thing around the UFO aspect. And then we know that at the UN, he mentioned the alien, if we were faced with an alien threat, how quickly our differences would vanish. It's a very unusual thing to mention at the UN. Presidents never mentioned it, even as a joke. So it's quite remarkable that he did that. And then there were certain writers that he had for his speeches who tried to take it out over and over again. And he would write them little notes and say, "Put my fantasy back in." And this is him. He really wanted that to be a part of it. This is his own subtle disclosure, just like Nixon doing the documentary. The time capsule, I think, now when I look back on it, it looks to me like Nixon had this idea of revealing this to the American people, and he was going to do it in association with Pine Gap in order to run for a third term. I don't think he anticipated Watergate, and when that hit, he realized, I've worked on this, and somebody else is going to basically get the credit for doing all this, and it's not going to come out. These forces have blocked it, so I'm going to hide it for posterity. That's why the Merritt story always made sense to me. Aside from the fact he had incredible command of detail, the story makes sense because all of these different people had some role and they left stealth archives, and I've pointed that out. That goes all the way from Eisenhower and his time capsule to JFK and LBJ's X letter, which is supposed to be opened in 2023, and so on. And we have other examples of it, including in the 50s, this whole thing that was done to do a snapshot of what civilization needs, basically. It was the Rockefellers and Kissinger. And 4 of those volumes are not, you can't see those. They're the classified ones. So it's very interesting. The other thing is that our friend Thomas O. Paine, when he donated his letters at the end of his life, he donated all these different boxes to different places like MIT and all the rest of it, but 4 of them are classified. You can't touch that stuff. But he donated them anyway. So we have these archives. We're aware of them. We know that they're out there. Even the Nixon time capsule, we're aware of it now. It's on the record. So they had these ways. I mean, in some ways, some people used letters and they said, hold this at my library. Other people used human recorders, people like Merritt, who would record the story and say it at some point. So these things they're out there and they form part of a pattern, I think, of when this information comes out. And how are we going to be ready for it? That becomes the next question, I guess. In relation to the Spielberg ET thing, Ronald Reagan had developed something and announced it in his 1984 State of the Union address. It was called Space Station Freedom. And this was the original version of it. It was going to be this incredible, and it's kind of a dynamic piece as we look at it, but it was going to be a gigantic hosting facility for these ships that were going to leave Earth and be up there.
Where's that supposed to be?
It's supposed to be above Earth and between the moon and the sun and Earth.
Wow.
There. Yeah, it's quite remarkable. And so Space Station Freedom was Reagan's version of the Space Force, and he's bringing it out there. And the idea was it was going to be a permanently crewed Earth orbiting space station in the 1980s. And Reagan had put all this money and time into it. It was originally designed. And eventually what happened was they tried to say, well, you just join the International Space Station, big deal. But this thing was much more dynamic. As the Apollo program began to wind down in the late 60s, there were numerous proposals for what should follow it. Of the many proposals, large and small, 3 major themes emerged. Foremost among them was a crewed mission to Mars. That came from our friend Thomas O. Paine. Remember, he's incredibly innovative. And if we really think about this, it could be that he resigned from NASA and ostensibly, although he went back into corporate America and even became the CEO of Nike for a while, he very well could have been the kind of NASA director for the secret space program, because they developed all that stuff over 50 years. They kept it black. We knew nothing about it. And then now they're like, hey, it's a war of the billionaires getting into space. And, look out for the Davos crowd, and Richard Branson's going into space. And the other millionaire that's taking him on, with his space thing is Jeff Bezos. Watch them duke it out. Totally different thing. That has nothing to do with moving the culture forward in space. It has nothing to do with exploration of space. It's just, first of all, Trump is saying, hey, it's a war-fighting domain. We're going to boot shiny weapons up there. That's a disgrace. Jeff Bezos being like, hey, we're going to be billionaires in space. And Richard Branson, we're going to have a big tourist trap. That's not the road.
Space hotels. That's what it's about. Mm-hmm.
Well, Bigelow does that too.
Ugh.
And we know he's part of the whole TTSA op. So,
well, they're bringing their egos up there with them. They're oversized egos.
Absolutely.
And
well, the thing
problem.
is, remember what Fitz said too, which I think is very important. Catherine Austin Fitz identified that when those projects went black, they were still using our money. This is the thing about it. So now they enjoy the benefits of privatizing space while we spent how many trillions to build it? So she's like, I want to fight for us to get our share of the rights to space for what they built up. That's only fair since it's the American people who, put in the time and energy and spent their taxes on it. Instead, we got this line about it, and all these trillions started missing out of the government. So this has to be the conversation. The conversation needs to be more dynamic in this sense politically. Forget about, did Trump wake up and say to the Ukrainian dictator that Biden is my enemy? That doesn't mean anything to you and me on the ground. I'm sorry, at all. And, in Trump's case, he can't go back to 2003 rhetoric, and this is the Bush administration bombing Iran, because he has some advisors over there who are telling him that's a good idea. Trump needs to go back to what he came into office to do. Remove us from those foreign entanglements, one. Two, protect the borders, right? Build up the economy. Those are the things that he was mandated to do. Instead, you have the vaccine companies. If you let the vaccine companies run ramshot over the American citizenry, it's not going to make any point to have good employment numbers, because everyone's going to be in terrible health. So, you can't let 5G, he's like, hey, forget about 5G, let's 6G, The problem is these things are proven with health studies for the detrimental effects. So the corporations are just taking over and harvesting people and running, just ramshackle through the government in the process here. And in the middle of it, we have this little petty fight about, is Trump racist? And like, if we don't agree with him, can we impeach him? And then the Trump administration, basically taking us into idiotic positions in space militarily and idiotic positions in the Middle East, which he was not doing in the first 3 years of his administration. So we're in a very unusual place. And I think that if we don't get some kind of correction around this, and it could be by the secrecy, removing the secrecy, pushing that subject forward, it might force them into a different place where they just have to deal with reality. And it's important because if we don't, it's going to be very hard to support, the actions of the current administration if they start bombing Iran, for example. I mean, what are these people who are super patriots going to do who wanted Trump in there to straighten things out? If he starts, there's a lot of very disappointing things going on. He's got Alan Dershowitz representing him in the impeachment trial. I mean, come on. Alan Dershowitz is the ultimate swamp dweller of all time. And, those people who are so, they look at the Epstein story and they see it as the ultimate example of that elite corruption. But Dershowitz was right in the middle of spending time on, he was as close to Epstein as you could get. And he spent time on that island and even admitted it. So how can you have him run your... So you have to wonder about what's going on in the Trump administration. I think it's a serious crisis, and he needs to throw out people like Pompeo and get a whole new crew, because I don't see really the benefits to him having a second term if he's going to go for war in Iran, be represented by Dershowitz, and try to militarize space. So this is a big problem. And then the Democrats have just taken a completely psychotic pose, anti-Trump pose. They have nothing to offer, except for basically extreme, like they've gone so extreme left that they're unrecognizable as a party. So I really think a third alternative is brewing, because these things, trying to portray Trump as the alternative in all this isn't working. I'm sorry. If he doesn't clean up his act, it's a real problem. Yes.
Our standards are too damn low.
I think this is it. And, we've seen people in relation to the thing about militarizing space say, well, we have to do it because the Russians and the Chinese are going to, I mean, come on. First of all, if you don't want China to be such a major power, stop borrowing so much money from them. That's one. Two, Russia spends in a year what we spend in a week on defense. We just spent $740 billion for 1 year on defense. We're not even technically at war. So this is all boondoggle money, and it's a gravy train. And that kind of stuff has to be stopped, because it makes fights over things like Social Security and Medicare and stuff look ridiculous, because that's such a smaller portion of the budget. This big arc of military spending, it's defense spending, quote unquote. But what it is really is the largest giveaway, that has happened since the 2008 crash, where they gave away all the money to the banks. So we're going to have some kind of correction there. I don't think there's any doubt about it. So the UFO aspect is very interesting in how it relates. And that's what we need to kind of round out here. Because this kind of secrecy around it bears a great deal and gives us a great amount of insight of what they're up to, especially when they're doing these kind of fake stories through the New York Times of like, hey, look, we have a tic-tac UFO and all that stuff, when those videos have been out there since 2007. That's not real UFO disclosure. And the CIA is running it. So we really need a turnaround here. But what we first need to do is formulate it and what the problem is. And that's the kind of thing that I was talking about with MLK, and it's kind of a good day to do it, is his idea of rebuking. He was rebuking the government on these different subjects. And this is what's so important, I think. In order to get things to be better in society, you need to articulate what the problem is and then articulate alternatives. So this is the crucial aspect, and this is the place I think we find ourselves.
It's a character issue.
Yes, well, the character of a nation too.
Exactly. It's not just the character of our leaders, it's our own character. So, I mean, if there's one power we can take back, is taking responsibility for ourselves, for our consciousness, for our conduct,
yes.
Our karma.
Yes.
And start there. I have very little control over what happens in Washington. I can see they're out of integrity. And rather than railing at them, I can look at my own life and see where I can do better. And we can all do that.
Well, that's interesting too. Because I always talk about 2 minutes hate on the show. The 2 minutes hate thing is so important to understand what George Orwell gave us in 1984, because in 1984, they get people whipped up into this frenzy about Goldstein, and they give them the 2 minutes hate, where they go out to these screens and scream at the screen about Goldstein and how he portrayed everything. And then they go back in their hypnotized state back to living in this dreary 1984 reality. And that's the way they control them, by giving them that outlet. We can never allow the mainstream media, which does that all the time, we can't allow the independent media to act like that. Just having figures on the national stage that we can hate isn't enough. We need to know what the fundamental issues are. Who's driving things? Who's driving militarization in space? Is it Lockheed Martin and Boeing, because they stand to gain the greatest amount? And are they funding Trump's campaign for 2020? And is that why he's suddenly kind of talking like a war guy? I mean, these are the questions we need to get fundamental answers to. What about the incredible explosion of mandatory vaccines, which wasn't there before? Now they're trying to remove religious exemptions. And this is like, remember that people who go for traditional rounds, like they had a whole vaccine schedule that seemed reasonable and was public, in the public interest. Now it's gone into insanity, where they expect you to have 75 some odd vaccines. So that's obviously a play for the pharmaceutical companies. So there's too many questions there that need to be answered, and the mainstream media has just collapsed as any kind of a format. So here we are doing it. And when we do it together, it's very it's key that we take in all the major points, and the UFO aspect is crucial to this because it represents not only off-world technology and all that. If you don't want to go into that aspect of it, just the advanced technology, what I referred to as barrier technology, that's inside of that UFO file. That's the X technology. The reason it's barrier technology is it's not just physical technology. That's the problem that they've had with it. And what I introduced on this program, and a word that we need to kind of keep in mind when we talk about this issue, is apophthegm. Because it's not so much, I don't think what they're hiding in the UFO file is just the fact that there's an off-world civilization or there's advanced technology. It is that the effect of that technology releases something which is a reality distortion field, and that when UFOs and things like that show up, what we get is, you know, cars that stop and missiles that won't shoot and people losing time. It upsets the normal law of physics, and that's the thing that they are trying to master and kind of keep a handle on. That's the thing that they're trying to keep everyone away from. So apophthegm forms another piece of our understanding that we need to get our hands on. Everyone, you're watching X Series 79, the Dark Journalist Show, and I'm here with Miss Olivia. How's it going out there?
Good. Zombie Wolf wants to know, is the USA the first country with a space force?
With a space force, yes. I mean, there's the European Space Union. You know, China and Russia have their space programs, but we are the ones who have really kind of come out and with the gloves off saying, hey, we're going to dominate, which is exactly the opposite of the way we were presenting this. So I think Trump is way off there, because even presidents that I don't like in the past didn't say that. I mean, this is really provocative, crazy talk. And the idea that we can dominate in space and threaten other nations is craziness. So what we need to do is seek cooperation with other nations in space, and space has to be a weapons-free zone. That's just all there is to it. That's what we signed on to, and there's a great history of us doing that. Yes?
Silver Fox wanted to know, do you think they will have a constitution for space? It would take a visionary to create a space constitution, but whom?
Well, they do have an agreement with a series of companies on space, and I mean, it's a kind of a loose space constitution, and it does have, you know, no one can introduce weapons of mass destruction in there. And, you know, that is something that was signed onto by a number of countries, including the United States. So we can't lightly turn around and start putting nukes up there. And if we do, we're going to have to, you know, that there's going to have to be a major pushback against that kind of activity. Yes.
Liberty Thunder wanted to know, hasn't space already been militarized for quite some time with missiles using GPS from satellites and spy cameras from satellites and such like that?
Well, a lot of that is lower Earth orbit, the way that they handle that. And it's not that they don't defend satellites and things like that. That's not what we're talking about. When they talk about making space a warfighting domain, that's a fundamental change of doctrine. It's not a warfighting domain until the Trump administration moved us into that pose. And that pose is against everything that we've set up with the space program previous to that. So when the space program came out, one of the things I posted on Twitter earlier was that, you know, Eisenhower signed on to what Congress put out there, which is space will not be used for anything but peaceful purposes. You have to stick to it. You know, that's who we are. And if we start to change that and people start, you know, through the back end start making money through militarizing space because it represents all these things we can do, then you're really looking at the civilization moving backwards drastically. And that's not, the space program is supposed to get us into a totally different cultural level. The reason President Kennedy put so much weight around us getting to the moon is that it could move the culture. This is the thing. And if it moves the culture to a better place because people are aspiring to something better, if you're just going to put weapons up there and, you know, try to create a space environment that's full of weapons, you're going to drag us into a space war. And that's disaster. We don't even know what the ramifications of something like that could be. We should be reducing our nuclear arms, not getting rid of treaties that Reagan and Gorbachev took years to negotiate. So we're in a madness stage on the arms thing. I don't know what's going on there.
Well, actually, getting right down to it, the problem is what Catherine always talks about, the what's her term for it?
A central banking
Central
warfare
banking
model.
warfare
Yes.
model. And that this is the paradigm that we are living under, is that is a predatory model.
That's right.
That weakens us all, right? It exploits our weaknesses, takes advantage of us. And somehow the answer we need to get to, the conversation we need to have is how can we take our power back within and to shift that paradigm? It's not an easy thing. We can't come up with it in 5 minutes.
Right.
We actually have to spend real time asking ourselves how we can overturn this 5,000-year-old system of domination and work together so that, because our leaders are interested only in domination
Yes.
and for profit, right?
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, most of us have grown up and think there's no other possibility.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's fundamental too, because, you know, what you don't hear, you know, you hear about people saying, well, there's this issue, or you can't use that word, or whatever it happens to be, but you don't hear them talking about militarization of space. I mean, so that is a blackout, and the social media companies and the media companies are doing that because they are going to benefit in some way from this. So they know where their bread is buttered, and they're not going to talk about it. So they're trying to kind of control the narrative and the conversation. But this is a pretty major issue to leave out on the table. And unfortunately, I have to say, quite honestly, that the administration is on the wrong side of this, and so are the Democrats. You know, I don't see that there's no. The only good alternative, you know, maybe would be some of the libertarian camp and the way that they talk about these matters. But I have not seen anything encouraging.
How in debt is the U.S. right now?
Well, we just scaled over to $21 trillion in debt, which is the same amount of money that's missing. That's good.
I mean,
actually, let's get into the questions. Go ahead. What do you got?
I'm just, you know,
Yes.
we're never asking, where are we getting the money for this?
Yeah,
We're
right.
just printing the money. We're actually broke.
Right.
I mean, how broke are you when you're $21 trillion in debt? You know?
Yeah. Now let's think about that. So it's a balance, you know, and I think what's disappointing is that the Trump administration, when it came in, had upset things to such a degree that it had the possibility of moving these things around, but now it's starting to look very much like a toy for the military, which is and I think the corporations now are saluting the administration because it's getting back into this like corporations rule thing. So they need to reverse course there, and I think the first thing to reverse the course is throw out Pompeo. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of quick things. Trump says he was briefed on Navy sightings of UFOs. Okay, so now the media is asking the presidents about the UFO topic. Okay, so we see something is happening with the UFO file, the way that they're doing this. By the way, Trump was like, "Oh yeah, but you know, it's no big deal." Then a recent disclosure: the top secret UFO files could gravely damage U.S. national security if released. This is very interesting. First of all, what they've said in the past is we don't have files like that. Two, what they've said is they don't pose any national security threat. That was their stance before. And then they went into complete, like, kind of a black zone with it. They didn't want to talk about it at all. Now, top secret UFO files could gravely damage U.S. national security if released, says the Navy. Now they're saying, one, that there are top secret UFO files, and two, that they do have the ability to damage national security if they're released. This is problematic on a lot of levels. So in response to a Freedom of Information Act request, a spokesperson from the Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence confirmed that the agency possesses several top secret documents and at least one classified video pertaining to these UFO encounters. And what's interesting for me as I go through this is there's some kind of tug of war here that's going on, where there was the Trump administration coming in and talking about the Space Force and doing all this. That was their way of getting their hands back on this UFO file, quite possibly because John Trump had told his nephew about it via Vannevar Bush. That's one. Two, Hillary Clinton started talking about UAPs. She's the one who rolled out the op around that, and she had John Podesta as her campaign manager, and they were all involved with DeLong. And then DeLong was supposed to do To the Stars Academy, but Hillary was supposed to be president. That didn't happen, and so they ran the op without it, which is why it's so weird. It doesn't have the presidential support, and it's kind of a freak show of every day we get a new thing about why Elizondo, the CIA guy, is lying about running ATIP. And, you know, you have people like UFO journalists and stuff like George Knapp trying to cover for him, you know, when he should be just reporting, hey, you know, on the record, the guy lied. So we're in a weird situation about where do you get the truth? And, you know, it's interesting. There's some kind of a battle over how some of these things are going to come out that's taking place. And all forces seem primed to benefit from it by saying there's a threat. And that's like the thing that I think we need to deflate in the middle of all this. Now, a quick thing about the Space Force, and this is Trump announcing the Space Force here, is on the record now, the Space Force is the 6th branch of the U.S. Armed Services and the first new military service since the Air Force was created in 1947. So it is a major shift. It's a tectonic shift. 70 years they haven't done this. So it means that they're moving into a pose around this. The question is, are we moving into a false UFO threat aspect? And is that why there's so many stealth archives put out there and placed out there? Are those stealth archives to help us kind of push back this moment? Are things like the Nixon time capsule and these different letters that are out there that are associated with it, are they meant to give us the tools to push back against what's being brewed here? President Trump, on the record, okay, space is the world's newest war-fighting domain. That's the number one thing for us to point to on this. That's the direction that we can't go in. How he got from space as a place that we need to explore and expand and all the rest, that he turned it into a war-fighting domain that's just a military boondoggle for Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and others. And that's what we need to point out, and that's what we need to stop. President Trump said during the signing ceremony, amid grave threats to our national security, American superiority in space is absolutely vital. And we're leading, but we're not leading by enough, but very shortly we'll be leading by a lot. You know, that I want to point out a combination of language here. Listen closely to who put out the press releases. Quote, top secret UFO files could gravely damage U.S. national security if released. Trump, ready? Amid grave threats to our national security. Somebody is saying, unless you can put this on the level of a threat, we can't ram it through and make a lot of money from it. So that side is trying to promote a threat, and now the Trump side is trying to promote a threat. So it's the wrong direction in both, and space should not be a war-fighting domain. This is a major problem, and you know it's problematic because I think when Trump comes in, he's the guy who's going to bust it up, and he's set a lot of the things in the system on its head, and it did some good. But if he now becomes an imperialist trying to start wars in space, he'll unravel all of that. I want to point this out to everyone. There is a period where in the 90s, the internet expanded the economy. And then into the 2000s, after we recovered from 9/11, you know, all these things happened. Now, the Iraq War, they took us into, and they spent all this money there. And that war took us into the crash of 2008. So we lost all the money for the Iraq War, one, and two, and all that time, we damaged our reputation around the world by doing that. And then we took all the money and they dumped it out in 2008. Now, They've come back, they've reinvested the money, and they want to get us into a bigger war. And that is the war with Iran. That's the one that they're pushing. And then the space war is behind that one. But then what happens at the bottoming out? Because remember, Iraq, we spent all those years in, spent thousands of dollars, millions and billions of dollars. And Iran becomes, it's much larger. You know, we're talking about 90 million people versus 8 million. And to get us into a war with them would be the greatest foreign policy blunder in the history of the United States. And then to take this militarization and space idea, and now it's the UFO threat idea. This is the next one. We've seen these predictions, even Carol Rosin in her work with friend of Braun. Whenever we get around this, that they're going to create these different threats, and that by the time they get to the alien invasion threat, that's going to be a totally false threat. So this is the peril, I guess, in the nature of the situation that we find ourselves in. And with that, Miss Olivia, I turn it over to you and your capable questions.
Okay, so the first thing is, Forward Fighter says, if you listen carefully to Fitz, she acknowledges that a ledger that shows a space fleet and extraterrestrial assets, we might balance the books. That would require disclosure naturally. What do you think? So if we demanded a full accounting, that we would have the disclosure that we all want.
Well, the problem is for them is that if they've been using public money for 50 years in secret, that if they suddenly announce, hey, there's all this stuff available through a privatized space thing, but you don't own any of it, then all the citizens that have put their money behind these programs can dig through the records and sue them. So whose space program is it anyway, becomes the question. But what happened in the process, if we look at it, you know, remember JFK tried to get the UFO files, you know, out there working with the Russians on it. And according to E. Howard Hunt, that's why he was assassinated. So we know that he was trying to move this out. Nixon was trying to move it out. And he got Watergate. And so he didn't get to try this Pine Gap alternative energy thing using his knowledge of the UFO file. You know, Carter and things, I won't even go into that, but Reagan, again, takes it very seriously. And what they have to do with him, because of his curiosity, is say, you know, they show him things that make it look like a threat. And so he takes Gorbachev aside on the record. Gorbachev has gone on and said this, that Reagan said, will you help us if there's an alien invasion? So he's contemplating a threat with it, and he builds Star Wars. You know, and then as we went through the different programs for things like the Clinton administration, he developed the X-33. And, you know, by the time we get to the Space Force, that push-pull in the government over the UFO file, the people that have controlled it, really, the X-Protect group, it's in a situation where other people want it, and there are other people in the know. And so you have these forces that are facing off against each other. Now, the UFO aspect, if it's just advanced technology or if it's an off-world civilization, whatever it happens to be, that's something that's not in the public realm right now. So we're looking at what could be a very dangerous situation if we don't get through the wall of secrecy, because they can sort of pretend that it's something that it isn't. And I think that that's very important for us. If we don't get a handle on the UFO secrecy aspect, then we stand to lose, because it's not a question of is it an off-world civilization or not. It's a question of what can they pretend is a threat where they'll, you know, throw the world into a panic and bring us into this war footing again. So I think it's a very slippery slope, shall we say. Yes.
Najat Madri, what was Reagan's Star Wars original intent? Was it a starting point to move war into space?
Well, Reagan was an idealist, and what he wanted to do, he had looked at a number of ways to reduce the nuclear threat. Well, I mean, right off the bat, what's wrong with us now that we don't look for ways to reduce the nuclear threat? Why are we talking about making new nuclear weapons? It's absurd. So Reagan from the very beginning was looking to reduce our nuclear stockpiles, because he was somebody who believed that we could set off and trigger our own Armageddon. He was a very spiritual guy. But he also realized he was dealing with kind of, you know, the Russians were seeking their own type of superiority. So he was trying to figure out, how can we do this? And SDI was his solution, that he always referred to SDI as a shield. And then he would say this over and over again, shield, shield, shield. He was thinking of a way to protect that shining city on the hill, which is America, from a nuclear exchange. It was a great ideal and a great vision from his part. But I think the way that it was manipulated was that whatever they developed, remember that they kicked in and ionized the atmosphere. If you look at the work of Ilana Freeland, who we've had on this program many times, that made SDI and Star Wars and things. Now it's really active, because then you can really create a global control grid on Earth, and through things like the space fence, really dominate on the ground. So I think in terms of what Reagan wanted to do with it and what he was being manipulated into position to doing with SDI, it's two different things. Philip Corso went on the record, and the retired colonel, and said that they used it to basically create a warlike stance with these off-world civilizations, and that's something that they were concerned about them. They wanted to know if they could catch up to them technologically, and that SDI was their version of that, the Strategic Defense Initiative. But I think fundamentally the idea of moving outside, remember when Gorbachev met Reagan, they talked about the zero options, reducing nuclear arsenals around the world to nothing so that nobody had them. Obviously, they had something to replace that technology with. There's no question. Yes.
Conscious for now, if, as you say, you see Trump breaking treaties which were in place to sustain peace via MAD, mutually assured destruction,
Right.
Is this a clue he has access and intent to use all-powerful XTech? I just wanted to insert here, I think that there is such a temptation for men, in particular scientists and politicians, if they've got it, they want to use it. They want to experiment. Yeah. They want to see what happens.
True.
They want to blow things up.
I think the Achilles heel with Trump, and you saw it after the Soleimani strike, which is he'd been maneuvered into position by Pompeo to do that and guaranteed it was going to be this great thing. And instead, it was the first major blunder of his foreign policy agenda. Because we can't take on a war with Iran, and we have no reason to go to war with Iran. It's absurd. And what we should be working at is peace with all these countries, not, what did Kennedy say? Not a Pax Americana, where we say, hey, because we have big weapons, you have to get along with us. The greatest way that we can have peace and prosperity is to be a good example to those countries. And in space is a great place to do it because it's a new frontier. So when we say to them, hey, we're going to put missiles out there and we don't care about whatever treaties we have with you guys, it's a reckless position, and they need to move. They need like a real statesman in there as Secretary of State. I've been thinking about this, but they need somebody who has a remarkable sense of diplomacy, because to just, to have like a CIA guy who loves to threaten people in there, it's not a good thing. And the CIA has not had a good track record around the Trump administration, in case he hasn't noticed. So if I were him, I would try to limit their influence dramatically. Yes.
Okay, let's focus for a bit on the letter. Okay, so
yes.
Catherine Marcuccio, I wonder if Trump found the letter and set up the Space Force to get the new technology off the ground.
Well, it's interesting. I'll tell you what's fascinating about that as we get into this, which is when we did the interview February 14th, 2018, it seemed like a lot of announcement came out after the fact, as if something had been set off. And what Merritt told me through his contacts was that he'd heard through his intelligence contacts that a real crazy process had been set off to find it. And one of the things that he put in the final testament that I put up on Friday in our interview was that they had gone looking with thermographic equipment in the White House. Now, the details around if they found it or who has it is very tricky, and I don't have nothing that I would go on the record with. But
well, you might as well tell what you know.
well, I would just say that for me, it seems it's a toss-up as to whether they found it or not. It's not clear. But I would say this. It looks like with the announcement from the Navy matching what Trump said with the grave danger thing, it strikes me that there's something in that, and that it's possible that the information that Nixon left behind is either in Trump's possession or in the CIA's possession. It's one of the two. So I definitely think it's possible that they have it. Yes.
You're not going to tell the story.
Which one? There's a series of them.
Well, there is a story, a rumor, whatever you say, and you can just share it with the audience, saying that you don't know whether it's true or not.
Oh well, I mean, I've already put on the record that Merritt said that his friend, who was in the CIA and was retired, had told him that they had used this thermographic equipment in the White House when Trump wasn't there. There was also another story that he had it, but they took it away from him.
Like literally, it was in Trump's hands, and they took it away from him.
Yeah, but see, it's kind of
actually too juicy to be true.
For me, the essence of the time capsule story is that it's there and that they've gone looking for it. I think those two things are crucial. And actually, what would it actually mean if we had a document from a president, say from 40 years ago, that said, we have advanced technology and I'm releasing this as a time capsule to let you know in the future that I worked on this? I mean, it would have a pretty major ramifications. Then you wouldn't need like the UFO threat junk, and you wouldn't need, all these companies selling you this idea of war in space. So I do think it's valuable in this sense, which is, it looks to me that all of the things that Merritt said about how he got into the White House have been, there are people who have been in that business who have told me that he described it very well. And in terms of where he went in the basement of the White House and those meetings that took place with Nixon, all of that seemed very legit to them. Whether Merritt understood the implications of what Nixon was doing with it or why he was telling him that's a tricky part. But I think that we can go on the record using Robert Merritt and say, look, we've really, we have a story here of a guy who was a Houston Plan agent who says he met with Nixon 3 times, and that during the 3rd meeting, he read him a message, and that he gave him a message to bring to Henry Kissinger, and that the message that he was going to put away in the White House related to UFO disclosure. I mean, those are the facts of the case. I do think the Merritt story is important. What we have to do, I think, when we look at Merritt is understand he was right in the middle of all this, and that the Watergate committee had called him up initially to testify, and then his testimony, they didn't want him there. He's a player in that, in Jim Hogan's book, Secret Agenda, that went through all the Watergate details. His FBI files stretch from here as long as the eye can see. Merritt was there. He was at the very heart of it. People who were in the NYPD have talked about working with him to bust rings associated with human trafficking at the UN, things like that. So he is somebody who had this track record. So I think we have to, just on that basis alone, take his story very seriously. And I wouldn't be surprised if more things come out to support and corroborate the things that Merritt was telling us. Yes.
And could you go into how, as a letter, it would not necessarily show up if they were scanning for bugs and whatnot?
Yeah, well, I can say this, which is, for a certain period of time, I was given the location in the White House of where it was. And then later, it came out that, it was in this book that was in the library. But what I do think is interesting, that when I got the letter about it and where it was supposed to be, this idea that it was put into a volume of American history in the White House library, and that it was, just a thin folded letter struck me as maybe pretty ideal in a lot of ways, because this would be kind of a way where you would think, wouldn't be found. And then having known the way that these things work, for example, there's a story where President Kennedy, during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, is sending messages to Nikita Khrushchev through a journalist. He's not using the State Department. He's not using traditional channels. He gives a journalist a letter, and the State Department and people like that can't figure out, and the CIA, how Trump is communicating, how JFK is communicating with Khrushchev. So you see these channels, the presidents at a certain point have to use channels like Merritt. And one of the things we have to remember about Merritt is that at his very heart, what he was saying was that he was a secret courier of information. And we know that they've used those types of couriers. We've had other whistleblowers come out and talk about that, where they deliver messages back and forth, but there's no traceable means. So in Merritt's case, they taped the message to him. And that's how he was supposed to deliver it. And because he was a member of the Houston plan, he wasn't going through traditional channels. The FBI, the CIA, they couldn't check him out. So if Nixon wanted to get a message to Kissinger without alerting them that they were communicating about this, it seemed a legit thing that they would send Merritt out to do this. So it felt to me the authenticity of the story, because I had a background in knowing how they move government secrets. That holds up very well for me. And my own feeling when I got the location of where the letter was in the White House, the indication was that Caddy was willing to give it to the National Archives, that Merritt was, and that he had Doug Caddy write a letter to the National Archives on his behalf saying, I'll give it to you as long as you read the message to the public. And the National Archives wasn't interested in doing that. But I'm sure, just by the nature of the type of information, that the administration looked into the possibility. And whether or not they found it, I can't confirm. But it seems, with some of the things that have happened since, it seems a pretty good guess. No question about it. Yes. Okay,
so Truth Flower wants to know, was the letter Nixon wrote quoting Tesla? Was it his formula?
It doesn't, if you actually go to, I put the playlist in the description of this video to all the Nixon Time Capsule videos that I have. And if you listen to Merritt's recounting of the story and the letter, he doesn't mention Tesla. However, the actual technology that we're talking about in the formula could very well be exactly what Tesla was talking about. In this case, Nixon told Merritt that they got it and it was related to a being from Planet X. Now, when you think about Planet X, you know that they've talked about this all the way back to the 1840s. And it's been that suspicion that there is a mass out there that comes into the solar system. So Planet X has been on the drawing board for a long time. When Nixon was saying it, was that a kind of a slang? It's an open question, but there in the very heart of the time capsule thing is the X steganography, because it's Merritt who mentioned Planet X. I didn't say anything about Planet X. That's his story. And he was saying that it was through that being that they got this energy formula, and that they'd had the being, he didn't want to say in captivity, but they had been basically hosting the being since the early 50s.
Is that all the information you have on Planet X that Nixon shared and Merritt shared?
I mean, Merritt mentioned it was in the letter. That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think that Merritt's testimony is it's right there, and you can listen to those videos. I do think he describes it very well. And we have to remember, too, when talking about Merritt's meetings with Nixon, again, he was not interested in the UFO subject. And I can tell you, because I try to engage him in that subject over and over again, and he wasn't particularly interested. Mm-hmm. So he's just recounting a story about what happened. And we know very well from some of Nixon's stories, like we were reading tonight earlier, that this is exactly exactly the type of person that Nixon was, that he wanted to share what he was doing. His ambition about being the UFO disclosure president is evident in the fact that he hired, through the DOD, through his own people, Robert Emenegger, to direct a UFO disclosure documentary that was supposed to be seen on major network TV. I mean, this is a pretty big move. Now, what's fascinating, and what I wanted to see if I still have the quote. Let's see here. I think I do. This comes out of, this would be a kind of a a very interesting supplement to what I just said. This comes from a book called Presidents and UFOs. Larry Holcomb did a nice job with this, and it's all those stories that are around the presidents. And there's an interesting side note. Okay, so I'm going to read to the documentary story. As touched on above, Emenegger, who they had, through Nixon, had hired to direct a UFO documentary in 1972, I believe. Emenegger had mentioned to me a couple of years ago that some people from the Reagan White House contacted him about the possibility of reprising the original documentary and bringing it up to date. So here we have the move inside the Reagan administration to bring this out. They also want to, make their own UFO disclosure documentary. Again, each one of these administrations are weighing the values and the benefits, or maybe even trying to do it, and then they get stopped. For all we know, remember, Iran-Contra comes right after Reagan gets briefed about, these ships that are on Saturn's rings, basically refueling, and they're gigantic. And they basically scare the hell out of Reagan when he gets this briefing. It's like, what are you talking about? And then, the whole book by Norm Berggren, which was The Ringmakers of Saturn, that's where they got the information. And he was the scientist who had done it. He went on the record. So that story's real. So now what? Now Reagan's UN talk about if we were under some kind of an alien threat, would that unite our world? Obviously, feeding him that information and showing him that stuff in a hostile sense made him think, aha, there's a threat to this. So it's very interesting. Let's go further. I'll read this again. Emenegger had mentioned to me a couple of years ago that some people from the Reagan White House contacted him about the possibility of reprising the original documentary and bringing it up to date. It was my impression that this was just a feeler and it didn't go anywhere. Recently, he mentioned the event to me again, and I realized there was more to the matter than just a passing contact. I asked him to email me more details. Here are Emenegger's comments to me in his own words. Quote, "The work on UFO was not directed from the White House. I asked if Reagan requested it and got no answer. The request was from two Reagan appointees, Bob Scott and retired General Miller, heads of DAVA, Defense Audio Visual Agency, located at Norton Air Force Base where the first project originated." Obviously, they keep something very special there. "While waiting for the special UFO film material, I worked on a terrorist project with the RAND Corporation and participated in contact with the film studio to get a British film featuring the actual British SAS team in a daring rescue of an embassy to be shown. Final option, I think. We also talked about interviewing captured terrorists. DAVA was soon moved and nothing more developed on the UFO project." So they had reached out to him, and somewhere along the line, the request got quashed, whatever they were up to there. So again, we're looking at that, and then we're thinking Space Station Freedom, which we showed earlier, which Reagan announced in '84. This is the same time that they're contacting Emenegger. It seems like there's some new effort afoot. And instead what we get is more of a shutdown. We get SDI, which is militarization of space. And by the 90s, they're really even trying to shut down the UFO file. So it's a very interesting thing where the way that these forces work and how they kind of get together at a certain point, and then things are going to come forward and it gets shut down. That's the X-Protect barrier to all this. Barrier check. Yes.
Leslie Patton wanted to know, what do you think about the predicted significance of 2020 Nixon statement?
Well, I don't know what to make of that. All I can say is it seems like when they started the year off with this kind of World War III scenario, and we had gotten the Space Force passed basically over the holidays, it seemed like 2020 was ripe for something dramatic right out of the gate. And I think we're sitting here right in the middle of it, really. So, if we consulted a really good numerologist, I'm sure that they would say something even about the fact that it's 1/20/2020 today. But yeah, I do think there's something to it. And I do find it weird that Merritt seemed, in that interview from 2015 that I listened to, where he was talking about something completely different, that he seemed to predict Trump was going to be president. I found that weird because we know that Nixon predicted in the letter to Trump that he was going to be president. So I don't know. It seems like there is something about that. Yes.
David Tormina said, DJ, I've been thinking since Friday, couldn't Nixon's Western White House, La Casa Pacifica, the House of Peace, been a location for another Nixon capsule? I don't think it's been sold since.
I read a story about it being up on the market a couple of years ago, and the story literally was I think it was from 2017. But it did strike me as interesting, and there's no question. The thing is with Nixon, he was one of the best strategists of all time, and that's why he pulled in China. He was able to negotiate SALT II with Russia. I mean, he got incredible things accomplished, but he had such a trap door about, who he could trust and who he couldn't and all the rest that it unraveled him in the end. He got ahead of himself, but let's face it, the guy was an amazing strategist. But I think when it comes to this, he would have to guarantee for himself that all of the work that he would be recognized for. This is what he always wanted, was to be recognized as that great statesman. But here he wanted to be recognized as kind of saving America and being that leader of the world. So he wasn't going to get a chance to do it. So the idea that he would put it away, really, I think is sound. And I think that Merritt's story is authentic in that sense. We really have to deal with it from, I think if we jump to the level of what does it actually mean rather than is it true, then we start to move a little bit. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
It's dry in here.
Everyone, I want to remind you, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're on X Series 79, and this is Stealth UFO Archives. We've been talking about the impact of those archives on the UFO file through the presidents JFK, Nixon, Johnson, and Trump. And, we kind of had to spell things out a little bit on the Trump side tonight because of all the aggressive stances that they've been taking through the Space Force and the Iranian thing. But, he's in a position to do incredible things on the UFO file front, and he's in a position to do great things with leading the world. So it's always that opportunity. And predominantly what I've seen is there's some members of the war party and members of that kind of neocon idea, and some of those forces. And frankly, there are other countries like Israel who would like us to be involved in wars in the Middle East. And I don't think that it's in our best interest at all to get involved in those wars. And so I think that the big thing for Trump, if he gets in for a second term, is a much savvier foreign policy team that deals more with diplomacy than just talking about shiny weapons and spending trillions on the military. So it's important to kind of point that out and hold open the possibility that something good will happen there. But it is also, you got to be realistic. And, if they're going sideways and if things are going in a different direction, then we have to get on board with that, figure out how to analyze some of these moves. What's interesting for me is Trump understanding certain things in relation to the UFO file And that's setting up the tremendous response against him inside the corridors of power, not wanting to deal with another major power player on that level. That has always made sense to me. And I think that's where we're at. Yes.
Nicholas Krupus, please ask DJ if
Yes.
Trump has a relationship with Henry Kissinger.
Oh, indeed he does. Absolutely. Yeah. Just Kissinger's been at the White House a few times, and he's one of those go-to people for Trump. Well, I heard him giving the advice of nuking North Korea, actually.
God, he's as bad as Cheney.
I mean, that was an interesting thing for him to say, given his position. He must have known it was going to shake them up. But it is interesting, too, with North Korea, because I think the Trump administration practiced the right kind of diplomacy in dealing with them. And the fact that that fell apart is interesting to me, too. I wonder who's driving that wedge. Yes.
Okay, Najat Madri. Where's Henry with the letter? It's true. He had his own letter, right?
Henry doesn't. Henry's about as ex-protect as you get. Nixon put a lot of faith in him, but he, he's a Bilderberger, and he has always been a deep player in the deep state. So I think what Nixon must have been doing is thinking, for his own posterity, since Kissinger worked with him and that he shared this with him, that he must have been thinking it won't get lost if I give it to Kissinger, and that this will come out. Again, he's guaranteeing for himself and the world that this will come out at some point. That's what I think is crucial. We have to look at Nixon from a variety of angles. Remember, he's a lawyer, one. Two, he was launched onto the political stage by backers who were very interesting in the sense of the whole Howard Hughes connection that we've detailed in this program. And he was launched into the vice presidency at the age of 39. Actually took over as president when Eisenhower had a stroke, briefly there in the 50s.
Was he the youngest vice president?
Well, I believe the youngest was Teddy Roosevelt, who became the youngest president when Taft was shot, but the youngest elected president is JFK. But I think Roosevelt was like 41 when it wasn't Taft that was shot. McKinley was shot, and then he was the VP, and he took over. He was 41 years old, and I think that he got behind Taft. And then when he left office, it was interesting because Taft took over and basically tried to unravel everything he did, and that's why he ran that Bull Moose party in 1912, which is how we got Woodrow Wilson. So it's a very interesting story back there. But yeah, I think in terms of it's interesting with VPs too. I learned this, that John Kennedy was the one who got the rule changed so that he could have someone represent him through the Space Council and through NASA, and that he didn't have to attend and be in charge, and that literally his vice president could do it. And we see Pence taking a really big role in the Space Force. That linking of the vice president to that position still holds. And I think we're going to see a lot more with that. Oddly enough, before the Space Force, Trump had announced the Space Command venture, and he had the Secretary of State sitting with Pence, which is a weird thing to do, to talk about, Space Command, and then you have a Secretary of State there, almost as if you're going to interact with some people. So they've been hinting around something, and I think it's just, how do you get any kind of truth out of these situations? We really have to go the extra mile and look at some of these leaders and what they've left to get a handle on it. So we have a better way to manage this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're going to be taking a few more of your questions. We're going deep tonight in episode 79 of the X series. And this one is all about stealth UFO archives and the presidents tangling with XTech, what I'm calling now barrier technology, which is the barrier technology is what they're protecting the most because it takes on a physical characteristic and also something else. But I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. that is the best way for us to stay in touch. As we know, we're just under siege on the social media side. And on a whim, they could decide, hey, we've had enough. So we don't want that to happen. And the best way to stay in touch with us is to go right into that newsletter and sign up. And you won't get much. I mean, it really just shows up once a week, and it's not much of a marketing thing or anything like that. It's just letting you know what shows are coming up and the incredible, and I mean incredible, remarkable shows we have coming up for you, and events, and being the one to really get in on those events first. We're going to take a couple more questions now. By the way, go to Dark Journalist and subscribe. Also, we've made it very affordable, and I've left last year's discount up there, which is very, just want to make it easy for people to get on board. That's going to be there till January 31st. So make sure that you go to Dark Journalist and sign up, support our efforts here, and keep everything moving along. We appreciate that a great deal. We're going to take a couple more questions, Miss Olivia.
Okay, Shamanist Alamkara. So Nixon was ousted with Watergate to stop him from disclosure. Could you go into that a little bit more?
Well, I mean, there's a few things around Watergate. First of all, they've known for a long time that the group that ran, remember when Nixon ran these plumbers out of the White House, that it's like an in-house intelligence agency, kind of like what they were trying to do with the Houston plan, but the Houston plan was really like as dark as you can get. And it's still classified, by the way, and Merritt was the employee for the Houston plan. But with the plumbers, what they were trying to do was send them on these jobs and like break-ins and to do different things to get intel, and that they didn't have to report back to the CIA and then to the president. They just do it themselves and come back with the info. So when Nixon got sort of led into this, that the trail could lead back to the White House because Howard Hunt was running those plumbers for him. What's interesting is that Howard Hunt had told his son that he was working for Nixon, but he was working for the CIA, and he was reporting to both, so that they wanted to know what he was up to. So it was very easy for them, once we know that, for them to set him up. But then what's interesting is they also hung him out to dry and let him take prison time. So there was all sorts of things that were associated there. The point I was trying to make about throwing Nixon out is that Nixon was starting, because of his successes in China and Russia and because of his big re-election win, he was starting not to listen to those voices, and he was moving on this UFO disclosure track. There's no question about it. So if you really put it together with what Hunt said about Kennedy being removed and being assassinated because he was about to share the UFO file, and then you think about Nixon's efforts to do a disclosure documentary and develop alternative energy through this formula at Pine Gap, then you see it very differently. Then you see they have to get rid of him, and to preserve their own paradigm. And they're afraid this guy now has too much power, and he's going to basically sacrifice our interests. So the Rockefellers and the people of this ilk, they don't want Nixon having that much power. And it's much easier to play on his weaknesses, which is a kind of a paranoia and not being able to trust people, and to use that against him so that he deteriorates in the White House, which he did. Look, resigning the presidency is no small thing. And impeachment, although they, it seems like once a week they do it now, it was a really big deal back then. It had not been tried in 100 years, and now it's like the flavor of the month. But so we have to remember the stakes were very high for what they were trying to do with Nixon. And it wasn't related to war because we were already out of the war. And you have to start looking around. What was all this related to? And the fact that he wanted to run for a third term and had confidently spoken to people about that gives you some inkling that he had something up his sleeve, which was maybe this alternative energy. Yes.
Okay, so David Tormain again. DJ, what do you think the reaction of the media would be if Trump did attempt to release the contents of the capsule? Why not just do that now if he had it?
I think Trump is a curious enough person to wonder and to search for it. And so going with the idea that he found it, he could be easily convinced that it would be outside of the realm of national security to do that. The idea of the time capsule message, it would be interesting for me, it seems obvious that somebody has, that the attempts to find it have been out there. I think I can almost say authoritatively that major efforts to find it have been undertaken. In terms of what they do with it when they find it, it's interesting to theorize if Trump has it and he came forward with it, it would give him the upper hand in this sense, which is the whole UFO disclosure aspect would swing back to the presidency side. And that would really set off some major alarm bells for the people who've been controlling it since the aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex assassinated President Kennedy. So it is an explosive question. Why wouldn't he just do it? I think that there could be a lot of advantages to doing it.
Well, if Kissinger had it, Israel would have that information, wouldn't they? Don't you think?
Not necessarily. I mean,
Come
it depends on what kind of a player he is. And remember, what's interesting, if you look at some of the Mae Brussel material on Kissinger, she actually said that he was kind of not very pro-Israel, which is odd. Very interesting. I think that she felt that he was part of the kind of paperclip thing because of who his sponsors were. And that he
we could do a whole episode on him.
You know it's true. But I do feel it's interesting. Look, I want to say this about the time capsule stuff. I spent hours talking to Merritt about this. It seems to me that the time capsule idea, the letter that Nixon put together for UFO disclosure is beyond a doubt. The question is this the period where it was supposed to come out? Is this what Nixon had intended? That's a really interesting question. And did Robert Merritt accomplish this feat of having us get access to it by coming out and doing the interviews and letting people know it was out there, even though he had his own conditions about how he would give the location? Once he mentioned it, once he went on the record with it, which he had never done in all of his interviews. He had hundreds of interviews about Watergate and everything else. It had never happened. And he reiterates that in the interview, that he had never, ever mentioned the secret message. So I do feel that it's significant in that sense, in that it could make a huge difference. Yes.
David Donaway. Okay.
David Donaway, it's great to see you out there.
With the big question.
Yes.
But what if the UFO file is a psyop?
No, there's enough sort of government and pop culture information relating to the UFO file to let us know, in fact, that it does exist. The phenomena exists. The next question is, where is it coming from and what is it? And I think that's where all the abduction stories and all the rest of it come into play. But I actually think, strangely enough, that's an interesting, really good question to end on, unless you have a follow-up.
I have a couple things that are linked. Okay, so one, Mirror 13 says, have you or Douglas Caddy received a response from the White House regarding Nixon's time capsule? We were talking about what to do with this story at this point.
Yeah, well, there's a possibility of putting the White House in a position where they have to answer if they have knowledge of the time capsule. And I've talked about that for sure. I think that...
well, what kind of pressure could be applied?
Well, for example, the letter to the National Archives was the first thing, and they didn't want to do it that way, that's for sure. And then the next thing was they just used the information and tried to bulldoze finding it. Now, Merritt had told me that his place had been broken into back then. Now, this was in the summer of 2018. So that's when a lot of this activity that I'm talking about was taking place. So it would seem to me, if they found it at that point, they've had it now for a year and a half. So there is, I think, something significant to that. What could be done, and what I've looked into, is putting together enough of a public petition about it. You know, they have the White House petition site and all the rest of it. So it might be something that we go forward with doing. I have talked to a few people about this. And I'm going to, of course, there's going to be more coming up in relation to this story. So I absolutely feel that the story has resonance with the period of time that we're looking at because it relates to this UFO disclosure aspect. So in a sense, it's Merritt's historical story, but I feel like it is, it's something that does have that relevance now because it's relating to this period. That's what it was vouchsafed for. So it's the opening of something. And I think through the work of people like Merritt, Cathy, and others, that this could very well be the time. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'll take your last question.
Okay, I have to ask this question.
Yeah.
So Lennon Tulsa, dark journalist, do you think that Trump or Obama or any elected U.S. governmental officer has followed your investigations to find out what they are not being told by the government?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The thing is that there's a lot of information that comes through this program, and I think the level of knowledge that they have inside the White House relating to some of these things comes directly from the fact that they know how to tune in when information is being disclosed like that, just like I think they listen to Fitz. And if anything, I would hope that they do take it to heart that, a lot of these questions about space and the UFO file, it doesn't matter, if we're going to find out in relation to this large scale mystery about the UFO thing, if we just take it on and sort of anthropomorphize it into this, war thing or whatever, and be like, well, let's have a fight on the moon and send up shiny weapons and stuff, we'll be better off not knowing about it. But if we can take it on as a culture and have it move the culture forward the way that Kennedy talked about moving, our journalists, our kind of moves into space, having this impact on the culture and how it should be available to free men everywhere, the things that we find there. This is the big difference, I think, behind the wall of secrecy and the national security state that we've developed and the real kind of, the great things that are vouchsafed for us. So for me, I have a feeling that as the citizenry becomes more aware of these things, it's going to inform the actions of the leadership. They're going to have to be compelled to take it in a more serious direction. And I don't want to see them slide into a war footing over these things and take us back to, a state that was worse than not even being aware of these things. I mean, it's so important, I think, understanding the UFO file. There's deeper things to it, much more than what's been presented through, pop culture channels. And, if you really look at some of the really good researchers, people like John Mack who've gone before, there's much more a deeper story here to be told. And I think that's really the crucial aspect of this. And we're going to be telling it from here on out. We'll be back with you next week in our normal Friday spot at 8 p.m. But it's been great to be with you on this MLK holiday. And I have to say that MLK is a great example for us now about being to call out things from the leadership to change the situation on the ground. And that's a great example. And remember, it comes through that lineage of Gandhi, and Gandhi goes right back to the Theosophical Society representing the mystery schools. So for me, that is a really significant loop for how we see political action. I think the Space Force is significant. We need a real conversation about it. We can't just become super militarized. And, I know there are fans of Trump and enemies of Trump and all the rest of it. I try not to see it from either of those angles. I just know what's right, and I know that we can't be dragging war into space. And I don't care what politician it is who represents that position. If they represent that position, I back them.
Yeah, and if I hate to say it, but if there is, to a certain extent, like a war in space already, but it has been behind the scenes and now it's
right
out This may be our only chance
Yes.
to claw back some power.
Absolutely.
Right? Because if it's just out in the open and we all accept it, then we're doomed, right? We have no future.
No, there's no question about it. As a matter of fact, I'd like to take this moment for you to read your little space thing on Twitter, if you got it.
I don't know what space. Oh,
Yes.
I turned my phone off.
No, it's right there. It's right there. Just go ahead and type it in.
Oh, on Twitter?
Sure.
I don't have that technical
what's interesting
expertise
is
in this.
Olivia wrote a really interesting thing about space.
I just said that I have no interest in going to space if we bring our warmongering up there with us, and that I would rather us use our brilliant minds and our resources here to solve our problems, and then when we have that together, we can go out into space as one human family. And a lot of people agree with me on that one.
And that's absolutely, this is the type of conversation I think that we need to be having about this. And this is what President Kennedy was getting at also. So it's quite significant. And that's the thought that I want to leave you with tonight. Remember that space is all about expansion. It's about discovery. It's about science. And so many great things about moving the culture forward. And we should never let space become militarized as part of anybody's agenda. And I think that these presidents who've tried to bring out the information about the UFO file have been aware of that. And from JFK through Nixon, through Reagan and Trump, I think that they've had this willingness to make it part of our consciousness and to have us understand it and make decisions about it. And that's a crucial difference versus the protect wall of secrecy people. I think the real danger with the current administration and with the current scene is, we see the media and stuff spinning the UFO threat thing on their side. And now we have the Space Force talking about threats. So if everybody's just going to go into threat land, that's what we need to have the conversation about and change the conversation and move it into something much more constructive. This is an amazing subject for us to open up and explore. There have been people who've given their lives to give us some extra insight on this. And so therefore, I think we should be paying attention. And with that, Miss Olivia?
I have to thank some super chatters.
Yes.
Okay, James Belch, Data Relay, Bill Gomez, Big Papa Pump, Seven Synesthesia, Charles Marlowe, Josh Randall, and Bogus Hype. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you for your support, and for our subscribers also. I really appreciate it. It makes all the difference. And when you get behind this show, you help our efforts dramatically. It makes all the difference. I'll do a couple of shout outs here since I'm up. Najat, of course, it's great to see you. Harry Honkinen is knocking it. Lee Veltman, it's great to see you out there. Scarlet Fire. And David Dunaway, who really knows how to do something with a limerick, let's face it.
That's Thomas Tyson.
Oh, well,
with a limerick.
Dunaway also.
But Dunaway has a great sense of humor. No question.
It's great to see everyone out there. Avishai, terrific. Thomas Tyson, excellent. Really nice to see everyone join us here on MLK Day. We will see you next week, and we'll be back on our Friday.
Are we going to be live this Friday?
Well, we might have something very special for everyone, but we'll be back with the live show next week.
Okay.
And Starzar, terrific. Josh Randall, hey, it's it's terrific to see you out there. It's always, it's great actually to see all of the great people out there tonight. It's really fantastic. We will be back with you, like I said, next week, and. I see a couple more. Mirror 13, great. I know if Kate's out there, it's great to see you. Audie Murphy, Tono, El Capitan. Do we have any other of our moderators tonight?
Carly was there for a minute.
Carly Dimensions Beyond, fantastic podcast that she has. Craig Coleman, it's great to see you. We will see everyone next week. And remember, space is exciting, and the UFO file should be ours to share.
Yeah, and let's all just. This is making it's making everything clear. It's bringing everything into focus. We need to ask ourselves what we can do right now to have a peaceful future.
I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah. And the truth is that it is a pivotal point. So it's interesting when you look at Merritt's Nixon prediction. In that sense, I don't think there's any doubt regardless if something cataclysmic happens or not. But I don't think there's any doubt that it's a crucial year. And
I'm tired of war. I mean, we've been at war for almost 20 years. Aren't you? And just most of the 20th century, whether it's the hot war or cold war, I think it's time that we just say enough is enough. Everybody has to really want peace and really be sick of war. Yes. But that also means being tired of conflict, inner conflict, outer conflict, conflict with our neighbors. I mean, peace starts with us, and it's not goofy, hippy-dippy peace. It's about having a higher vision for ourselves and then holding each other also accountable for that higher vision.
Hey, listen, I'll take hippies in space if that's what it takes. Thank you, everyone. It's great to see you. Thank you, Miss Olivia. You did a fantastic job. We will see you all next week, and have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody.
And it says end broadcast here on this big button, but it never really ends, right? Hey, it says end broadcast twice.